1 minute.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it is time now for our last edition of the week of this most disruptive show in American and global politics and current events. In the Independent Corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, going straight into the headlines as we do each morning. Joe Biden now has 253 Electoral College votes, while Republican Mr. Trump has 214. To win the White House, a candidate needs 270. In addition to Georgia, counts are continuing in 4 states with razor-thin margins in Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, and North Carolina. Trump must win Georgia to leave him with a path to win. According to the most recent data, Mr. Biden is leading in the state by 917 votes, less than 1,000 votes, with most votes now counted. With its 16 electoral votes, winning the state would put Mr. Biden just one shy of the crucial 270 vote threshold needed to win the presidency. If Trump does not win Georgia, the most electoral college votes he could possibly get is 269, which would leave the candidates in an unprecedented draw. No news organization has yet projected the state as a Biden win. Authorities in the state have said they hope to have a result today. The results of Tuesday's election hangs in the balance with counting still underway in several states. Jamarl, this is notable. Georgia seemed like it was in Trump's pocket going into the end of election night. As the voting has continued, however, not the voting, as the counting has continued, however, it seems those have come primarily from Biden's counties, from Biden-leading counties. And it's a very, very close race.
Yeah, it does seem like Biden is going to take it, but barely. I mean, and that's amazing. Georgia going to the Democrat, profound. Razor thin margin. I mean, I suppose 269 is possible. But it does seem like Biden, if he gets any of these states, he's going to take it. Trump seems like he's going to get Pennsylvania, but it seems like Biden is going to get the other one. So it's fascinating. The fact that Georgia went blue.
Here's the other complication here, though. Trump came out and did a press release
he
last
lost
night.
White men. He lost white men. Like he gained every other group. Yeah. He gained among blacks. Yep. He gained among Hispanics. He lost among his main base white men, which is astonishing considering that's the base who he was pushing for.
It is interesting. I wonder what exactly affected that.
They think it was
I'm
permission.
sure there'll be a lot of analysis about that.
Yeah, there will be. I mean, but they think it was an issue of permission. Like, you had all of these other groups and all of these other people, military generals and stuff coming out basically saying Trump was lying or denouncing Trump. And the hypothesis is that gave people permission to, I don't know. Like you said, there's going to be all sorts of analysis that come out after the fact. And I am very curious as to why. Like, why did they abandon him? Was it an economic issue? Was it racial stuff, meaning the racial tension in the Black Lives Matter protests?
Yeah,
I'm curious.
Could have been BLM. For some reason, that's where my mind went first.
You think so?
I mean,
like
the
where
other side of this is
where it did change opinions.
Yeah, but Yeah, it might have changed opinion, possibly, maybe seeing his response on it, or it could just be COVID. I mean, those really are the two main contenders. Maybe that's just because they're top of mind. They happened in the last year. Maybe people have just been subtly swayed by the Russiagate thing. There are a bunch of options here, and it could be, it could be economics. It could be separate from COVID. It could be people. It seems very specific, but maybe people not liking what he's doing with China, for instance. I don't know, man. One quick note here, though. Trump came out in a press conference last night and was saying he feels like if you count only the legal votes that he's won, he's pushing for court cases in the key battleground states here, including Georgia. And specifically those court cases, most of the ones that I've seen him talking about have to do with observers. So if assuming they might do a recount, they're going to be doing that recount ostensibly, at least, with more full observation by outside observers. What he was saying in his clip last night, he was kind of rambling, so I didn't feel like it made sense to clip it and play it here. But basically, in Michigan, specifically, there were these facilities where they had observers who were legally authorized to come in, but they were like keeping them outside the building, and they had papers boarded up papered over the windows so that the observers literally couldn't see inside the building. That sounds a little bit hyperbolic, but that also is a very specific claim to be making. So I don't know, man. Anyway, next headline here. Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook took action against the account of Steve Bannon's podcast on Thursday evening. That's the former White House chief strategist. They did this because he had called for the beheading of Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's top infectious disease expert. In the video, Bannon says the heads of Fauci and FBI Director Christopher Wray should be displayed on pikes in front of the White House as, quote, a warning to federal bureaucrats, end quote. Twitter said that it had permanently suspended that account, the war room and pandemic, for violating its policy against glorifying violence. YouTube said it took down the video for breaking rules against inciting violence and issued a strike against the account. Under the Google-owned video platform's 3 strikes policy, the offender cannot upload videos for at least a week after the violation. Facebook, which Bannon used to live stream the podcast, said it removed 2 videos from his official page for breaking rules around inciting violence. That's just remarkable. And that seems pretty, I almost can't help but think he wanted that outcome. I can't help but think that he's not a dumb dude, as far as I know, that he was saying that stuff specifically so that he would get removed, so that he could cry about being removed from these platforms. That's arguably.
Right-wingers, that's in their wheelhouse. Think about what Hitler used to do. Hitler's complaint was always, this person is doing this. The Polish are attacking us. The Polish are doing this. It's like, we must redo German, Germanists, whatever. And if you notice, Trump does similar stuff. Like where Trump goes out there, God, I hate it. I shouldn't have done that. I didn't mean to make that illusion. I've been reading this book, The German War, and it talks about German homeland while they were at war, and trying to, give this idea of what it was like on the homeland while this kind of total war was taking place. That's the only reason why the illusion, the back and forth. But if you notice, Trump does that all the time. He is like, these people are doing this to me. Or he would say something like, they're cheating me. Or if I lose this race, the only way I can lose this race is if I'm cheated. Come on. Are you serious? Or the media is doing this. Now, the catch is sometimes he's right. The media does treat him a particular way. The media does treat him different than other presidents.
Yeah. He's absolutely right about that. 100%. And even the stuff with the voting fraud, like, I don't know, you don't know, we don't know. There could be stuff going on, and it could be on a scale where it prevents him from getting elected.
I doubt that.
But
there's nothing to show for that. There's no there. Like,
and here's the other side of it. Show that. Here's the other side of it, real quick. It's that if that were the case, wouldn't the Democrats have swung the Senate too?
What do you mean?
Like if there were a coordinated campaign to commit voter fraud, wouldn't they have done that not just with the presidency, but to get a majority in the Senate?
Yeah,
they would have tried to take.
That's why I don't buy the voter fraud stuff. When experts look at this, oftentimes they find it like so insignificant, and you have Trump screaming about it, but Trump was screaming about it before it even happened. And what Trump was calling voter fraud was just mail-in ballots. If you're putting it in perspective, so I don't buy this unless there's some there to it, especially with the level to which Trump lies. And you're right.
Yeah, I don't buy
if you're going to rig it,
I don't buy it either.
Don't you take it all? Like, don't you make sure that Biden gets, because think of what happens in 2024.
I don't want to dismiss it out of hand, though. That's the thing. I don't want to dismiss it out of hand, you know?
Think of what happens in 2024. If Biden takes the presidency, you're going to get a Mitch McConnell Senate, and you're going to get a weakened House of Representatives. What's going to get accomplished? Mitch McConnell is going to do everything that Mitch McConnell wants to do, and he's going to work with Biden to do those horrible things. Now, the question becomes, is that enough for Biden to take it in 2024? Or does Biden lose it to somebody like a Mike Pompeo or Ted Cruz because he couldn't get anything accomplished during his term?
He's still alive.
Yeah.
I mean, and that is a real concern, whether or not he's still going to be living at that point. I mean, not, that sounds cynical, but he's an old dude. Yeah. Anyway, moving on to other headlines. More than 250,000 Danes in Denmark went into lockdown on Friday, that's today, in a northern region of the country where a mutated variation of the coronavirus has infected minks being farmed for their fur, leading to an order to kill millions of the animals. Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen said the move was to contain the virus, and it came 2 days after the government ordered the culling of all 15 million minks bred at Denmark's 1,139 mink farms. It's a lot of mink farms. Wouldn't it be this is a sort of dismal joke, wouldn't it be a mink ranch? I'm used to thinking of farming as being something you do with plants and ranching as something you do with animals. Minks are definitely, they fall into the latter category. Anyway, in 7 northern Denmark municipalities with some 280,000 residents, sport and cultural activities have been suspended, public transportation has been stopped, and regional borders have been closed. Only people with so-called critical functions, such as police and health officials and other authorities, are being permitted to cross municipal boundaries. People in the region have been urged to be tested. As of Saturday, restaurants must close, and school students from 5th grade and up will switch to remote learning Monday. In Indonesia, authorities have begun evacuating people living on the volatile Mount Merapi volcano's fertile slopes on Friday, that's today again, following an increase in volcanic activity. The head of Yogyakarta's Volcanology and Geological Hazard Mitigation Center, Ane Kumaita, warned that Merapi, Indonesia's most active volcano, could erupt at any time, possibly sending hot gas clouds down its slopes up to 5 kilometers away. The almost 3,000-meter mountain is about 30 kilometers from the Yogyakarta city center. About 250,000 people there live within a 6-mile radius of the volcano. Merapi spewed ash and hot gas in a column as high as about 6 kilometers, 3.7 miles, into the sky in June, but no casualties were reported then, but it seems like they're preparing for a full eruption now. In Paris, Shakespeare and Company, the iconic bookstore that published James Joyce's Ulysses in 1922, is appealing to its readers to support after pandemic-linked losses in France's spring lockdown have put the future of the iconic left bank institution in doubt. The English-language bookshop on the Seine River has sent an email to customers last week to inform them that it was facing, quote, hard times, end quote, and to encourage them to buy a book. But we've been down 80% since the first confinement in March, so at this point we've used all our savings, end quote. That is Sylvia Whitman, daughter of the late proprietor George Whitman. Paris entered a fresh lockdown on October 30th that saw all non-essential stores shuttered for the second time in 7 months. Since then, Whitman says she has been overwhelmed by the offers of help Shakespeare and Company has received. There have been a record-breaking 5,000 online orders in 1 week, compared with around 100 in a normal week. That's representing a 50-fold increase. And last story here, luxury car maker Bentley has announced plans to go fully electric by 2030, just like Dylan. Before then, the brand will be switching its model range to offer only plug-in, hybrid, or battery electric cars by 2026. Volkswagen-owned Bentley also claims to be completely carbon neutral across its manufacturing within a decade. Electric cars are growing in popularity and sales have tripled in the UK so far. Within a decade, Bentley will transform from this is a quote, Bentley will transform from a 100-year-old luxury car company to a new, sustainable, wholly ethical role model for luxury, end quote. That is Adrian Hallmark, Bentley's chief executive. At least that's their hope. That's my comment. Workers on internal combustion technology will be redeployed. Fired? What does that mean? Redeploy? If they're switching to fully electric, and they have people who are currently working on internal combustion technology, this is saying they'll be redeployed. That sounds like fired. As the company shifts to pure battery electric cars. That is my reading of that, at least. In any event, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines. with Thomas and Stranahan. And I am going to take us to a slightly early break here so that we can come back early on the other side of this break with more time for Jamarl's monologue and conversation following that. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be right back with Jamarl's monologue.
Fault Lines. We are talking.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Octung, baby.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, definitely give us a like and share that content. Also, if you want to join in on the conversation, don't be shy. You can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can give us a call, 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Call in. Right now, as it stands, thanks to Jake Tapper, while you were sleeping, Biden has taken the lead in Georgia by 1,096 votes, with about 10,000 ballots left to count. In Pennsylvania, Trump still leads 18,229 votes, with about 163,000 votes left to count. 50,000 of them in Philly. There's going to be all sorts of lawsuits that Donald Trump is throwing, many of them ridiculous. When Donald Trump won by razor-thin margins, nobody took it to court or anything else, and maybe Hillary Clinton should have. But this time around, Donald Trump is taking it to court. Interestingly enough, even his own side is not necessarily on board with this. Chris Christie on the news channel, Chris Christie, ABC News. Chris Christie said it's Trump's right to pursue legal challenges, but show me the evidence. This kind of thing, all it does is inflame without informing, and we cannot permit inflammation without information. Even henchman Chris Christie, who stood behind Trump for like 15 minutes in one of the weirdest alpha male, let's say, presentations I think I've ever seen. Meaning Trump gave a speech, Chris Christie stood back there just standing weirdly. And the facial expressions were more interesting than the speech itself. But I'm making the point that his henchman is not even willing to go this road with Trump. That should tell you something. The reality of this is a race that honestly should have been a layup. I don't have to go through the tally. You know the number of people that have died. We've just hit another record number of people with infections, and those infections, deaths, tend to follow within 2 weeks. And we tend to see an uptick in deaths. I mean, this is like the second day where we're getting these monstrous numbers. This is even on to the point of what, 230,000 people dead, the number of people that are lost their jobs, the number of people that are going to be evicted. Like, you can go down the list, you can go down the ledger. And yet, it's this close. Why? Why? Isn't that an interesting question? If you go back and look at the polling, as we were talking about earlier, Donald Trump expanded his lead with every other demographic with the exception of white men, blacks, Hispanics, if I'm not mistaken, LGTB community. I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is that the strategy that the Democratic Party had used for the last 4 years has monstrously failed. I don't know any other way to describe it. Yes, Joe Biden may win this race, but the Democratic Party was hurt down ticket, despite the fact that they kept saying, Bernie Sanders is going to hurt us down ticket. Bernie Sanders is going to hurt us down ticket. You realize the Hispanics in Florida might have given Donald Trump, Florida, because of the socialism stuff. So what? That's one state. Joe Biden still may take this. It may be razor thin, but understand, even if you gave up Florida and you got the other states, wouldn't that be a better outcome? The DSA last night, talking about election night, won 28 of 37 national races and 8 of 9 major ballot initiatives, all written and organized by chapters. We helped put Cori Bush into the squad, and we now have Democratic Socialist caucuses in 14 state houses, now including Montana. Not too shabby, comrades. That's them talking about it. Oregon decriminalizes possession of all drugs. Oregon decriminalizes psilocybin therapy. DC decriminalizes psilocybin. New Jersey decriminalizes cannabis. Arizona decriminalizes or legalizes cannabis. Montana legalizes cannabis. South Dakota legalizes cannabis up to 52 to 48. I guess that plants. What I'm trying to put out here is that the lefty initiatives won. Those won. And the person who they say was going to knock it out of the park, Joe Biden, who was going to dominate, he was going to dominate the election, is eking out a win. And honestly, it could still end up in this kind of weird 269 tie. I doubt that. Biden may win this, but again, he's going to win it barely. And if you're looking at the loss of houses in the House when they were supposed to pick up houses, the not taking the Senate, and you think about what does that mean going for 2024? My point, and the reason why I bring up all this, is because I would like to make the point that lefties screwed up. Sanders, you screwed up. You hurt his chances. You didn't hurt his chances because of the weird ridiculousness that you may hear from some Democrats who is like, oh, Sanders shouldn't have ran and Sanders hurt Joe Biden by running. No. Sanders hurt Biden for the opposite reason. At the end of that race, when it was necessary to pull and push and attack and hit Biden, they were so concerned that, oh, we're going to lose it for Biden. Oh, it's going to be like Ralph Nader. That instead of being able to pull Biden to the position that was more advantageous, indicative or indicated by who won. Meaning the fact that the Democratic Socialists of America, who make no bones about the fact that they call themselves socialists, the fact that they won gets across that the public was engaged. The public was there. The public was willing to place that vote, but the public was willing to place that vote if it was in their material interest. And rationally, why wouldn't that be so? You've just had a pandemic. You've just had all these people lose their jobs. You've just had all these businesses go bust. And the Democratic president that's running in the race is acting as if, just like the last Democrat, that he's doing you a favor by even being in that race, as opposed to taking it as his responsibility to ensure that all of the material losses, all of the losses to health, all of those things to some degree are mitigated. That's not what you got. You got a person who ran a race, just like Hillary Clinton ran the race. And it was Hillary Clinton with a penis, basically, that was far dumber and not all that together there mentally. And believe that because Donald Trump had all of those items on his ledger, that the public was going to be so desperate that they were going to throw themselves into his arms. Joe Biden, again, may win this race, but this race should have never been this close. This race will be delegitimized going forward. Meaning in the same way they try to make it as if Donald Trump didn't win the race, that the Russians, Vladimir Putin, picked Donald Trump over and ran him over the finish line. Well, the same thing is going to be said about Joe Biden in this race. Not necessarily the Russians, but they will say that the Democratic Party cheated. And going forward, it would look as if, at least by a large contingent of the population, that even if Joe Biden wins, that Joe Biden had to cheat to win. That is going to be the mantra going forward, just like it was the mantra for Russiagate with Trump. Mark my words. Mark my words. We've ended up in this weird race to the bottom from the standpoint of our country, where America matters less. Winning is the thing that matters more than anything else. And even if that means delegitimizing the electoral process itself. With one caveat, it doesn't seem that Republicans, or at the very least Chris Christie, is going along with them. And it doesn't seem like media is going along with them. Even Fox News didn't seem to go along with Trump on this. So we'll see. But right now, it doesn't seem like the president is accepting the results. And more interesting and more important, What happens if the president decides to send electors himself? Meaning Trump decides, I'm not going to concede. What happens if the president says, not only am I not going to concede, I am going to continue to fight this until it gets to the House of Representatives, where they can send it to the states. And Republicans, because they have more states, can choose the president of the United States. Use the president of the United States. That doesn't require the Supreme Court. That only requires confusion, similar to the confusion you have now. The question becomes, does the rest of the population go along with it? Does the rest of the Republican Party go along with it? And my suspicion was that the Republicans in Congress didn't think Trump was their type. So I have a hard time entirely believing they'll go along with it, but you never know. The key point here, though, is the reason this race is this close is because the left, either Sanders, AOC, all of these people didn't take the opportunity to push and attack Biden. They were so concerned that Biden was going to lose to Trump. He's a walking apocalypse. We can't take the chance. Missing the point that elections are about more than just getting elected. Elections are about what are you going to do for the population. And the people who are going out there to give you that vote is giving you that vote with the idea that government is going to do X or government is going to do Y, or that there is some semblance of a social contract. They believe in these things. And so they go out and they vote. If a party, Democratic Party, who's living off of the image of FDR, is not going to actually push for real things, euphoric, or at the very least policy, deal with the conditions, then they should not expect to win. Biden, again, may slip through. But let's be very clear. This has everything to do with a lot of failings on Trump's side, nothing to do with the Democrat side. And in a race where a president has all this albatross around his throat, it shouldn't even be this close. And yet here we are. This should be something to know from the standpoint of the left. Attack Democrats. Push them to the left. If they don't want to appropriate your policies, then it's on them to lose. But at the very least, it is your responsibility to push them to get to a point where the public approves. Shane, what do you think? At the end of the day, last night, or the election night, it was clear that lefty policies, whether you're talking about the Democratic Socialists of America, whether you're talking about the marijuana or the mushrooms, these policies were wildly popular. And yet, these policies were things that Democrats ran from. Even if you disagree with Democrats on this stuff, like you could say, I don't agree with Medicare for all, but I do agree that it probably would have been something that Democrats should have pushed, as opposed to pushing nothing. You know what I mean? Like, they ran nothing, and they barely, if they do, eke out a victory. That's sad.
What do you think? So two different arguments here. One is that they, it's too expensive for their corporate backers to back, and so they're just not doing it. The other is if they start to make concessions to those more progressive economic policies, to really just more progressive policies in general, then their bases, their institutional base is going to be overrun. They're going to be pushed out, that kind of thing. They're going to be edged out by the progressive wave that they potentially see coming. Which do you think is it, or do you think it's both, or am I missing something, Jamarl?
What I think it is, what I think is that they were able to get, for the last 40 years, people to vote for them regardless. That's what I think. And so they have a history of basically saying, I can move to the right, and I can take the cash that's necessary for me to win, and I can be incrementalist, and the public will accept that because I can make the argument for that. And you move further and further and further to the right, and you get to a point where the public can't see a clear distinction between who you are and who the Republican Party is, especially from the standpoint of anything changing. I think they thought that motif will still work. And I think it's getting diminishing returns. I mean, the fact that the African Americans and Hispanics basically went up in Trump's favor is astonishing. And yet, that should give some kind of heads up on that.
Here's the thing, though. Cynically, voter turnout this year was
it was higher.
At a high. Yeah, exactly. So you say that it's getting diminishing returns, but unless you're willing, I mean, you believe that this election was legitimate. You're not, you don't think that the voter fraud was enough to sway it in Biden's favor. Isn't that a sign of it working? Like I guess this is where you can oscillate between it's going to get better because at a certain point, this is where I go. I'm optimistic because I'm like, this can't last. And then I'm cynical because I see it lasting.
Right.
So where does that crumble, Jamarl?
This can't keep going on. I mean, at some point, this has to come to an end, right? I mean, there's no way. But you look into the future, and you see Mike Pompeo, you see Ted Cruz, you see Tom Cotton, and you see a bunch of people who will scare blacks, the left, to fall in line. And so it's like, where does this stop? When does this stop? And how does it stop? And again, I keep making the point that the only way this honestly really stops is for people to hold their leaders accountable. None of this blue no matter who nonsense, none of this, this guy's a Democrat, so you just vote the person in automatically or reflexively. No, it really does need to be a representation of material interests. And until that happens, they need to fail. And I think what you're seeing here is, Biden might have been able to get over the finish line with this. But again, I keep pointing out, should the race have really been this close? I mean, honestly, the Democratic Party held the Senate for 50 years, give or take. And when they moved towards the policy of Bill Clinton, they started to lose it and it started to go back and forth. I don't think that's a coincidence. I honestly don't. And so, it's the number of people who don't vote tend to be Hispanic, blacks, or people of color, and people making under $30,000 a year. Those are Democratic constituencies, even if you're looking at the exit polling here, meaning they're hurting themselves, but they're hurting themselves with the idea that we just need to get in office. We don't need massive numbers. We just need to get in office. And that's our point, power. The question is, power for what? And you think to yourself, well, who are their constituents? It's not us. Clearly, it's not us. And so you ask, who are they getting in office for? And that's the part that I think is the most important, because it's not for us. Let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas, and you're also soon to be listening to our guest, Dr. Michael Neverdakis. He's an independent journalist and instructor at the American College of Greece. Dr. Neverdakis, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. So I'm going to go right into this. You're, I believe, still in Sweden. How are things going over there?
Yes, I am still in Sweden, and things have not changed very substantially on the ground in terms of day-to-day life since the last time we spoke. The authorities here do report increases in cases. However, that has not really translated into anything other than a stricter set of recommendations that has been issued for most of the country at this time, where people are asked to avoid unnecessary travel and unnecessary contact with people outside of their immediate circles, and to avoid crowded spaces if they can. But these are all, they're strong recommendations. They're not enforced. There's no fines. There are people that follow them, and there are people that just go on with their day-to-day lives as before. So one does not see a significant difference in terms of going out and, taking the bus or taking the train or anything like that. But there are some people that take more precautions as a result, and some businesses too that take more precautions. But all in all, it's ordinary life as before. And I will also mention that the country has all these different recommendations, And not one of those recommendations has to do with wearing a mask. It's still something that is not even recommended by the Swedish authorities.
How do they deal with companies? Like people, let's say if I worked at a company and I had some kind of medical illness or something that made me more susceptible from a standpoint of death. How do they deal with that? I mean, if you're not shutting down, let's say, the economy per se, or if you're not, let's say, enforcing, let's say, the mask, or you're not enforcing some of these other techniques, how do they deal in situations where the individual is forced to do something based upon their own needs? Like, I need my job. If you're not going to shut down the economy and ensure that I get some kind of resources, then I have to go to my job. And I may have some kind of illness associated with me that under normal circumstances is not that big of a deal, but if I get ill, I'm going to die. Meaning those people to some degree are almost forced. Or are they? Are there provisions in the way that they organize the society to allow people who have some kind of illness or some kind of other issue that won't necessarily be stuck with going to a job or somewhere else that may get them killed?
Well, that, from what I understand, and I'm saying this without having entered the Swedish job market yet, they are included in the recommendations that have been issued by Sweden. Very strong recommendations for people to work from home, if possible, and for employers to make available the possibility to work from home, if that is something that the job allows, if the job can be done without a physical presence at the workplace. Now, from what I understand, having read a couple of English language sites here, and without being in the job market in a country yet, there are employees that complained that their employers still have not moved to any sort of remote work. I think in that case, and again, without being an expert on this, that is something that the employees can potentially take up with the health authority here or with their labor union. From what I understand, there's a higher percentage of people here that are represented by unions than there are in the U.S., for instance. So that's basically it from what I understand. There's a stronger recommendations. From what I understand, some businesses follow them and some don't. And there is some kind of recourse if someone really feels that they cannot go to work, but they're being asked to do so.
This just seems like in the United States, for example, if you are working at McDonald's, you can't work from home. And you have a large number of people in the States, especially African Americans, especially Hispanics, basically people of color, who have taken a massive hit because they were working in jobs where they couldn't necessarily work from home. And we have a historical, let's say, climate that have structured our society in particular ways. Let's say it that way. Now, I don't necessarily know if Sweden has those. Clearly, it doesn't have the same historical context. But I would imagine that you guys have McDonald's, you guys have fast food, you guys have restaurants, you guys have service jobs where it becomes impossible for the individual to work remotely. Also, those individuals tend to have the least power in that group. And is that person really going to go through all of those hoops to try to ask management to stay home? I guess what I'm getting at here is it seems like this is greatly disadvantageous to people who are forced to be at various jobs, that they have the least power in those jobs. Am I wrong in that? Or am I mistaking something here in regards to the way Sweden is structured versus the way the U.S. is structured?
Well, from what I understand, in terms of the workplace in Sweden, relations between the employer and the employee are rather different than they are in the United States. So as far as what you're saying, again, I think a lot of this has to do with the specific set of relations that have been established between the employer and the employee in that particular workplace, and what, for instance, representation they might have from a labor union or a labor association I will say that, since I have begun looking for employment here while I continue my my ongoing job, which is based back in Greece, I will say that one thing that we're told as job seekers is that the union plays a much stronger role over here. And in fact, I was even told to, depending on the specific industry I want to get into, I could even speak to some union representatives from that particular field, and they would give me potentially some assistance or some advice into getting into that particular industry. So that just seems to indicate a different type of set of relations than we're used to in the United States, for instance. So as far as the issue that you raised, I think that plays a big part in it. And then the other thing that I observe is that probably the most evident sign of the most evident measure that one sees over here is social distancing, in the sense that businesses that are high traffic, like restaurants, cafes, like there's a chain of cafes over here that's like the Scandinavian Starbucks. It's called Espresso House. They're everywhere. They've done on their own. They've implemented various things that kind of ensure distancing between the employee and the customer, and also between customers. Like they space out the tables, or they don't. If the tables are like physically fixed, they tell you just to like sit apart, leaving one table in between empty. And the same with the employees. Like they just are a little bit further back from the customers. A lot of businesses have installed those plastic shields. And I've even seen in some businesses masks being worn. And from what I understand, that's just, in most cases, that's just something that is up to the employee if they want to do it or not. I've been to like clothing stores, for instance, where some are wearing a mask and some are not. So I think there's a lot of that sort of thing going on. There's like a certain level of measures that the businesses themselves can take voluntarily. There are even some businesses that have temporarily, reduced their operations, in the sense that like a restaurant might have fewer tables available and things like that, so that the crowding is less.
The Swedish Prime Minister is also self-isolating right now. He believes he has COVID.
Okay. Well,
mask.
All right. Well, it's any different than what one should do if they have any other sort of contagious illness. So, I don't think that's much of a surprise.
How are people, just based on conversations you've had with people in Sweden, what's their opinion of the lockdowns being implemented, pretty quickly and harshly now in other countries in Europe? What's their take on those?
Good question.
Well, honestly, from the Swedish people I have spoken to, I think that they find those sorts of measures ridiculous and really overkill for what is actually going on. I think most people in Sweden are rather happy to be able to continue their day-to-day lives. And I think a sign of that is the fact that you really still see very, very few people that wear masks. I mean, if I had to estimate, just if I go out and walk around in central Stockholm on any given weekday or weekend, what percentage of people are wearing masks? I think it's maybe slightly higher than last time, but it's still really small. It might be like 1 in 250 or 300 people. So I think, what I was told from a couple of native Swedes here is, that people are they have a mentality. They live in a country that has a rather rough climate, and that has given them a certain degree of hardiness. And at the same time, Swedes on their own, they are very good about taking the types of precautions in their lives that they feel are the best for them. So there's a lot, there is a very big climate of trust in the country overall, including a lot of, and it goes both ways. Like the authorities seem to trust that people on their own will do what they think is right, and vice versa. So all in all, that's the impression that I get here. And one final thing I'll say about that is that one of the first people I got to know in the country on the issue of masks told me that essentially masks are seen by most ordinary Swedes almost as a sign of weakness and as something that is really unnecessary for what is going on. And I think that's actually even reflected in the fact that masks are not included even in the official recommendations by the Swedish authorities.
I just thought it was an issue of...
Very interesting.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Donald Trump thought that too. He thought it was manly to wear a mask. I found that to be astonishing.
That's probably echoed. That's probably matched by attitudes by a lot of people in the United States. Yeah, no, and I say this as somebody who has worn a mask pretty consistently when I've gone into stores. I've had the opportunity to travel across the country. Attitudes shift pretty quickly when you go from state to state. So in California, in the Bay Area specifically, practically everybody, particularly inside buildings, inside businesses, et cetera, they were wearing masks. But elsewhere, there was a lot less, in the Midwest or portions of the Midwest, whatever the case may be, whether it's inside of restaurants, inside of gas stations, most folks aren't, including servers, et cetera. So it's just a sort of shifting pattern that you see in the U.S. fits our sort of regional statehood. Anyway, we're going into a break. We're joined by Dr. Michael Neverdakis, independent journalist and instructor at the American College of Greece. You can follow him on Twitter at Neverdakis. Back on the other side in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And we are joined by Dr. Michael Neverdakis, independent journalist and instructor at the American College of Greece. And by the way, you can follow Michael on Twitter at Neverdakis. Michael, I hear that you have a story. This is coming from our producer. He said that you have a short story that you wanted to tell us. Can you please get right into that? What's the story?
Well, I've had an interesting year in that I was working in Greece, and when the first wave of lockdowns began to take place, and I saw that a lockdown was coming to Greece, I made the decision that I wanted to, rather than just remain in Greece where I was living alone, basically, and working, to come back to the United States where I grew up and where I have family. And to stay in a home, which is in the countryside, in an area that is not very populated, and that it would be a better place to be under such circumstances. So I did so. And I stayed in upstate New York for 4 months and then returned to Greece in mid-July things seemed relatively normal then at the time, but they quickly got far more severe in terms of the restrictions that were being implemented in Greece by early September. And I mean, there were a couple of things that happened. I mean, my employer unfortunately refused to recognize my mask exemption, which I've received these exemptions from doctors in both Greece and the United States. And in fact, the doctor from the U.S. is rather prominent. I won't say a name, but is rather prominent in New York State. They were actually not just refusing to accept this exemption, and this is an American employer, by the way, but they tried to force me to resign, and they were rather nasty about it too. And in the end, the compromise, so to speak, was that I ended up working online, and that gave me the flexibility to come and try something different with my life, which is how I ended up in Sweden. And the irony is that Greece is now under lockdown. So classes have since moved online anyway. So I ended up just doing something that I was going to end up doing within a few weeks. But I'm going to take it back to when I went back to the US the first time in March. And seeing everything that was going on in Greece and in so many other countries at the time, in Italy and in much of Europe, I was in the United States with my family members. Those first couple of nights I returned, it must have been around March 18th, March 19th, around there. And I was really just very down about everything that was going on. And I was kind of just trying to look at the situation, not just from a health perspective, but from the perspective of how is something like this going to be used politically? And, you know, there's that old saying, you can't let a good crisis go to waste. And I was just getting a very bad feeling that something like this was going on. And I was having a conversation, and I was not in very good spirits. And I was asked, what was wrong? And I said, I don't see this going very well. I think there's going to be more lockdowns in the future. And I think that this is going to be dragged out to the extent that they might start talking about changing fundamental things about society. So I was asked, like, what? And I said, well, I can see something like this, if this drags out long enough and it causes enough damage to the economy that they could turn around and say, we need a new economic model. We need to try out something like universal basic income, and so forth. And basically what I was describing is what ended up on the front cover of Time magazine a couple of weeks ago, the so-called Great Reset. And just in retrospect, looking back, everything that I was sort of concerned about that evening back in March in upstate New York, we're now being told by a certain set of very powerful actors that this will be, and they seem to say this with a great degree of certainty, the new normal going forward. And honestly, for me, we can talk more about this if you want, but for me, that new normal is not a particularly enticing future for me, to say the least.
I don't see anything wrong with the UBI. I think universal basic income is awesome. And our environment always affects behavior. It would be weird if environment didn't affect behavior. It is possible that environmental events are used for political effect. I agree with you. 1,000% agree with you. Whether that has taken place with COVID or not, I don't know. And that is one of those things that is kind of a wait and a see. If I am your boss, I wouldn't be nasty with you, but no, I wouldn't allow you to go without a mask either, especially if you could potentially infect or get other people sick, even if you're a carrier and you yourself are not necessarily displaying symptoms. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can't get other people infected. I'm in Maryland, where I've had these arguments with people who would give this alternative set of facts, quote unquote, about, oh no, it's not that big of a deal, and Donald Trump said this and that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't care about the manliness of it. I think that's ridiculous. There's some people who say it's unmanly to wear flip-flops. There's some people who say it's unmanly to wear flip-flops. I guess the only point I'm trying to make to you is I understand that you have a certain idea that, look, this is, I don't want to wear this. I don't want to be held down by this. But there are other people who are being drastically affected by, let's say, outcomes that are greatly negative, that, let's say, may not necessarily have the scenario of Sweden, but it's somewhere like New York or somewhere like California, where you have these large population centers with these people that are packed in, and you have to do something to mitigate it. And it can't just be voluntary. I guess I don't see the point. I guess I don't understand where you're getting at. Let me ask you this. What are you trying to get across to us when you're saying that you had a mass exclusion or mass exemption and they wouldn't allow it?
Well, here's the thing. The mass exclusion, first of all, is not based on alternative facts. The Greek legislation that governs educational institutions that was passed right before the start of the new academic year very explicitly made this exception available to both employees and to students. So I was doing nothing different than following the law. And if the lawmakers who are being advised by medical experts feel that such an exception is acceptable, then all I'm doing is just exercising a right that is offered to me legally. And the same thing is true even if you look in the United States. For instance, my employer is registered in the United States in the state of Colorado. If you look at the state of Colorado and their mandates regarding the mask, those mandates offer the same exact exemption that is codified into law in Greece. So then there's a second thing, which is labor law, which in Greece pretty explicitly states that if someone has some kind of chronic health condition that impacts their ability to work in that particular workplace, reasonable accommodations must be made. So that's what I went to my employer with. And there were several reasonable accommodations that I proposed, none of which they even considered entertaining. And in fact, one of the things that I proposed to them from early on was I could just teach the classes online. So I don't even have to be there physically. And they initially rejected that. And they rejected it quite forcefully.
Right there. That's my point. Wait. You're getting to my point. And this is my concern. Like in the way that they rejected your requests. Because I think you're right. They should have just, if you said, hey, can we do the class online? That was a reasonable accommodation. And the other issue, there probably were reasonable accommodations that the manager or that the bosses didn't want to do. But that's because those guys, some of these people have in their heads, I want these people at work and I want them in a very specific way. And my concern with a lot of this has to do with the way companies and managers will treat employees, where those employees don't have huge number of options in regards to how they deal with, either from the standpoint of wearing or not wearing, or from the standpoint of their health being impacted, or some other kind of medical issue where the employer doesn't want to deal with. Does it make sense? Like, I'm agreeing with you, I guess. And I guess this is my concern with this.
Look, it does make sense. And one thing that I would say is that if we're talking about protecting people's health, that is something that goes in many directions. So for an issue like masks, there are people that are affected by them. And it certainly has been proven medically. And evidence of that is that various laws and mandates in different states and different countries recognize these exceptions. So at that point, the employer has to show some good faith as well. And that didn't happen in my case, and I've heard that this is true with many other people right now. But beyond that, not just to make it about my job, something about UBI and all these other changes, with any sort of policy, there's sort of like a good and a bad side. And a lot of it has to do with what the goals of the policy framers are. I think if you're talking about UBI within the existing economic structure where it serves sort of as a safety net for people that have jobs but their incomes are low, or who are unemployed, or who are unable to work, or something like that, it's much different from a society where the economy has been decimated so much, and small businesses in particular have been decimated to a very significant extent, that UBI then becomes de facto their only realistic source of income, creating a dependency on that income because there's really no jobs to be had.
Yeah, that's my fear. That's my fear as well. Just to be clear, Michael, that is consistently been the fear when we've had these conversations. I mean, we bring Scott Santens on to talk about unconditional basic income, and there's some merit to the idea, in some form with automation, things like this. But it's fundamentally the same thing, that you get a permanently subservient economic class beneath a political system that sort of buys their votes, buys their influence, whatever. That's my addition to it, but the idea of subservience definitely holds. In any event, we're out of time. Dr. Michael Neverdakis, thank you for joining us. For those listening, Dr. Michael Neverdakis is an independent journalist and instructor at the American College of Greece. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this break with headlines. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, Joe Biden now has 253 electoral college votes, while Republican Donald Trump, president, has 214. To win the White House, a candidate needs 270. In addition to Georgia, counts are continuing in 4 states with razor-thin margins: Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, and North Carolina. Mr. Trump must win Georgia to leave him with a pathway to victory. According to the most recent data, Mr. Biden is leading in the state with 917 votes, with most votes now counted. With the 16 electoral votes, winning the state will put Mr. Biden just one shy of the crucial 270 threshold needed to win the presidency. If Mr. Trump does not win Georgia, the most electoral college votes he could possibly get is 269, which will leave the candidate in an unprecedented draw. No news organization has yet projected the state as a Biden win. Authorities in the state have said they hope to have the results on Friday, today. The results of Tuesday's election hang in the balance, with counting still underway in several states. Shane, how does a Republican lose Georgia? How does that happen?
Well, if you believe the Republicans through voting fraud, if you believe the Democrats, it's because Trump has been an abominable president. And I don't know how to split the difference between the two, man. I'm sort of holding my hands back, holding my breath, waiting to see what happens.
I want to see the exit polling on this stuff. Like, I know the New York Times has come out with it, but I want to see like the analysis about why people voted. That's the part I'm most fascinated by. Because if those people come out and say, well, there wasn't really that much of an alternative. And I even give credence to what you were saying yesterday, that they might say, I don't want to go back through these lockdowns. I can't stand these things. And keep in mind, even if the majority of the country, where you might get like 60-something% say, yeah, we're okay with the lockdowns, that doesn't mean that all of those people vote. Like, you might have had a large contingent of the people who are voting saying we don't like it. So I don't know. I'm fascinated by the results of this race. I don't know why it's this close. I don't know how Joe Biden got more votes than Obama. That seems mind-blowing to me. There's a lot of weirdness in this race that I kind of want to see the end polling and end results, like the end exit results for that. So we'll see. But I don't buy Trump's assertion. Oh, there's fraud. The only way for me to lose this race is if there's cheating. I don't buy that at all. I think that's bunk. Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook took action against the account of Steve Bannon's podcast on Thursday evening after the former White House chief strategist call for the beheading of Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's top infectious disease expert. In the video, Bannon said the heads of Fauci and FBI Director Christopher Wray should be displayed on pikes in front of the White House as a warning to federal bureaucrats. Twitter said it, quote, permanently suspended, unquote, the account of @WarRoomPandemic for violating its policy against glorifying violence. YouTube said it took down the video for breaking rules against inciting violence and issued a strike against the account. Under Google-owned video platform, 3 strikes policy, the offender cannot upload videos for at least a week after the violation. Facebook, which Bannon used to live stream the podcast, said it's removed 2 videos from the official page for breaking rules about inciting violence. That is disturbing, to put it mildly. They had Fauci's head on a pike. That's insane. More than 250,000 Danes went into lockdown Friday in the northern region of the country, where a mutated variation of the coronavirus had infected minks being farmed for their fur, leading to an order to kill millions of animals. Prime Minister Matt Fredriksson said the move was to contain the virus, and it came 2 days after the government ordered the call of 15 million mink bred at Denmark's 1,139 mink farms. In 7 northern Denmark municipalities, with some 280,000 residents, sport and cultural activities that have been suspended, public transportation has been stopped, and regional borders have been closed. Only people with so-called critical functions such as police and health officials and other authorities are being permitted to cross municipal boundaries. People in the region have been urged to get tested. As of Saturday, restaurants must close and school students from 5th grade and up must switch to remote learning as of Monday. Shane, you know what this puts me in mind of? Do you remember when it was earlier this year, I believe, and it was during the economic crisis, and you had all of these farmers that couldn't sell their products, and the farmers they have stories of them like crying, shooting their cows or shooting their pigs or something to that effect. I believe those are pigs or something, but they were basically killing all of these animals because they didn't believe they could sell the animals. And it was like, well, at that point, that's where government comes in and buys up the products, be it chickens, be it whatever, and gives it away to people who needs it. That way, you ensure that the farm stays safe and stay intact, and you ensure people eat.
It's not so much that, I mean, there's certainly an element of that, that they technically couldn't have sold the meat, but it's also just they were trying to raise the prices. They're trying to keep the prices at a sort of high enough level where they could make their profits. But, and then this is a classic thing. If you get overproduction, then you need to destroy the excess goods. And that, keeps the prices up to a certain level that you want for your industry. But here's the other thing, man. If the farmers, if the ranchers were crying when they were shooting cattle and shooting their pigs, just think about how these poor Danes would feel about shooting their minks. Minks are just the cutest possible creature.
No, I agree.
And
that's my point. It's like, it is not an easy thing. Not to mention you're destroying production capacity. I mean, No,
it's true. But here's the other side of it, though. It's not just that they couldn't sell them. It's that there's apparently, like in the headline, apparently a mutated strain of the coronavirus going around, and they're trying to keep it, as they should, contained. Yeah, at bay. Exactly.
It's just the farmer thing bothered me because it's one of those things where if that farmer has to destroy that product, that's a product that somebody could eat. That's something that has value. That's something, basically production being destroyed because they couldn't find people who had the money to buy the production. I mean, come on. At that point, government steps in, government buys it, and all of these food banks and all of these people who need food and everything else, all of a sudden, they get a free meal courtesy of the government. Trump could have even put his name on it. This is courtesy of Donald Trump. You're welcome. He put his name on the checks, writing your name on that pig, and send it to people to eat. Indonesian authorities, and by the way, he would have had a much better chance of winning this race if he did. Would have had a much better chance. Indonesian authorities began evacuating people living in the volatile Mount Merapi volcano's fertile slope on Friday following an increase in volcanic activity. The head of, Shane, how do you pronounce this word? Yagavardis? You nailed it the first time around. That's why I'm coming to you and saying, how do you pronounce it?
Just 1 second. I'm having to.
I'm sorry.
Yogyakarta? You're talking about Yogyakarta? Yeah, the head of Yogyakarta is exactly volcanology and geological. I'll let you take it away, but yeah, Yogyakarta.
Thank you. The head of the Yogyakarta Volcanology and Geological Hazard Mitigation Center, Hanik Humandia, warned that Merapi, Indonesia's most active volcano, could erupt at any time, possibly sending hot gas clouds down the slopes up to 5 kilometers or 3 miles. The 2,968-meter mountain is about 30 kilometers from Yogyakarta's city center. About 250,000 people live within 10 kilometers radius of the volcano. Merapi spewed ash and hot gas in a column as high as 6 kilometers into the sky in June, but no casualties were reported. You know, my wife and I got married in Iceland, and there are all sorts of volcanoes in Iceland. In fact, you could see like clouds of heat arising, like these kind of hot gases and everything else rising from the thing. Well, you have houses, churches, like little communities that live under these volcanoes. We were like, whoa, how do you, like, wow. But again, that might get to this thing where people get accustomed to it. Like, you know, the thing hasn't erupted in forever. I think it erupted back in 2000, and you had all of these news people trying to pronounce the name of the volcano. It starts with an E, but it's like 20 different letters in it, in the word. It's a massive word that nobody can pronounce. It's really difficult to pronounce unless you live there. But you have people who live under those volcanoes.
I was thinking of looking it up just to try to bring it in, but the fact that there are 20 different, the fact that it's unpronounceable means that I really should not do that. I just want to throw in there. That's an awesome place to get married, man. That sounds incredible. That the wedding was amazing.
It was the easiest place to get. Let me say it was the easiest place. We tried, like, when I was looking at the different places, I was looking at France, I was looking at all of these places. All of these places had excess costs. Iceland didn't care. They didn't care if you were gay, straight, whatever. Iceland was like, come on in. We don't care if you're from another country. Have at it. And so that became the place. It was a great place. I mean, it's cheap to get to. It's expensive when you're there only because it's an island and everything has to be imported. But from the standpoint of expensive getting to it, it's cheap. It allowed pretty much anybody to get married. Great destination, beautiful location. Looks like you're on the other side of the moon. But interesting spot. It really was. It was a value. So yeah, I agree with you. Shakespeare & Company, the iconic Paris bookstore that published James Joyce's Ulysses in 1922, is appealing to readers for support after the pandemic-linked losses in France's spring lockdown have put the future of the iconic left-bank institution in doubt. The English-language bookshop on the Seine River sent an email to customers last week to inform them that it was facing hard times and to encourage them to buy a book. Quote, "We've been down 80% since the first confinement in March. So at this point, we've used all of our savings," Sylvia Whitman, daughter and late proprietor George Whitman, told the Associated Press. Paris entered a fresh lockdown on October 30th that saw all non-essential stores shuttered for a second time in 7 months. Since then, Whitman said she was, quote, "overwhelmed by the offers of help from Shakespeare that Shakespeare & Company has received. There has been a record-breaking 5,000 online orders in 1 week compared to around 100 in a normal week, representing a 50-fold increase." That is fascinating. When people care about something, they are willing to support it, man. Honestly. Luxury car maker Bentley has unveiled plans to go fully electric by 2030. Before then, the brand will be switching model range to offer only plug-in, hybrid, or battery electric cars by 2026. Volkswagen-owned Bentley has also aimed to be completely carbon neutral across its manufacturing within a decade. Electric cars are growing in popularity and sales have tripled in the UK so far this year. Quote, "Within a decade, Bentley will transform from a 100-year-old luxury car company with new, sustainable, wholly ethical road model for luxury," said Adrian Hallmark, Bentley's chief executive. Workers on internal combustion technology will be redeployed as it shifts to pure battery electric cars. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Here's the thing. As a software engineer, I've built systems that have, let's say, made people redundant. And oftentimes in those companies, they actually did move them elsewhere. In fact, I remember I was building a system that I was calling precog, because it would look over and figure out what it needs to give the workers before the workers even need to know it themselves. It was, I used to name stuff all sorts of weird stuff when we were doing software. And it became a system where it's like, all right, well, we don't really need 2 or 3 people in the mornings anymore, because this is doing their job, and it's doing their job better than they're doing their jobs. And so it becomes, okay, they're redundant. What do you do with them? Well, you move them into some other aspect of your company where you can increase your productive capacities elsewhere, ideally. In their case, it was only like 2, so it wasn't a huge number. But in Bentley's case, I get your point, Shane. You're like, you think that's a euphemism for those guys are going to be fired. Potentially. But let's just hope that they can move them over into some other system or some other faculty where they don't have to actually lose their jobs. Knock on wood. But shout out to Bentley. Applause.
Shout out to Bentley for making the change. Totally. Yeah. I mean, they could go to school, and it's not that. They could go to school again. They could try to retrain them. If these are inveterate members of the workforce, then maybe they want to reposition them within the organization. They've got that loyalty built in, and so they're like, okay, we're not working on these internal combustion engines, but hey, repurpose into batteries, into the lithium ion or solid state batteries or whatnot. In any event, we're going to go into a break right now, I think.
No, we are.
Let's do it. You're listening. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Back on the other side of this break in just a minute with Dr. Alex Vitale. Again, you're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan. But joining us on this segment, Alex Vitale, professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policy and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College and visiting professor at London South Bank University. Dr. Vitale, welcome to the show.
Good morning, guys.
So I'm just, from your perspective of this, I love the fact that the sociology. How do you view this election? I've been asking people, since that's the thing that's kind of on the minds of people. It's right now, it's kind of up in the air, even though it looks like Joe Biden is going to edge it out. Why was this election this close?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think there's a couple ways to think about this. It's really important to point out that Trump's vote totals increased, that his the percentage of Republicans that supported him increased. So this idea that there was some middle out there that needed to be captured by the Democrats going to the right seems to be really a questionable strategy. But also it suggests that the weak showing of the Democrats is not just that Biden was a weak candidate, it's that there was very strong affirmative support for Donald Trump. And I think we really, we can't just chalk this up to voter suppression and things like that. He got record turnout. So we really have to ask some tough questions about this, move to the alt-right in the American electorate. And that means that we have a lot of work to do.
I guess, Dr. Vitale, thank you for being with us. I would ask the question, what does it mean that we have a lot of work to do? Unless you're defining alt-right as literally terrorists, it seems weird to me that, in other words, if I were the right wing and I were in power, and there were, and then I suddenly switched perspectives to the left wing. If I heard that the right was trying to tamp down left wing perspectives, a la McCarthy, I would be admittedly cautious of that. So unless you're literally talking about, rampant racism, terrorism, that kind of thing. Where are you coming from there?
What I'm talking about is community organizing. What I'm talking about is that the mainstream of the Democratic Party has decided that politics is something that is accomplished through media ad buys. And that if they could just raise enough money from corporate bigwigs to buy enough television ads and social media ads, that's how you win an election. And what I'm saying is we need a 50-state strategy that's rooted in community organizing around really important issues, some of which, the mainstream of both political parties are failing to grapple with. What are we really going to do about climate change? What are we going to do about deep economic precarity, uncertainty, declining living standards by so many people in rural areas, red states, in inner cities, et cetera? And so I think we need some kind of, real political realignment here.
I agree that we need a political realignment. I just don't agree that Democrats believe in that stuff. I mean, it's one thing to live off the image of FDR. And I honestly suspect that the public noticed. Is this really a thing where Donald Trump and the support for Donald Trump was just that strong? Or there was just no real opposition? I mean, Joe Biden may actually win this. He may eke this out. And they may take a certain perspective of this, meaning this notion of some kind of the autopsy, that should take place, even in a situation where this race is this close and we're raised within margins. That autopsy should take place from the standpoint of Democrats, but it's not. I don't think they have this perspective of this community organizing or this push for healthcare and this other stuff that I think that they give accolades to. I think that's what they say. I think in reality what they do is something different. And I think the public didn't get a clear delineation between the two candidates. I mean, is that part and parcel to why Donald Trump outperformed in the way that he did? It wasn't so much that Trump was just that great. It was that the opposition was just that poor.
Well, there's a couple of things here. One is that I think you're absolutely right that the mainstream, the Biden wing of the Democratic Party, does not believe in a 50-state grassroots strategy. I think you're absolutely right about that. But there is a battle over the direction of the Democratic Party. And I think the Democratic Socialist wing, the Squad, AOC, they do have this vision. Now, this is not to put them on a pedestal that they're perfect or whatever, but that does signal a pretty concrete alternative to this centrist politics. And I would just say that, I'm sympathetic to this argument that the Democrats failed to distinguish themselves. But when both parties have record high turnouts, that kind of goes against that argument. It suggests that there was actually real enthusiasm. If there was nothing exciting about either candidate, you would expect to see reduced turnout, which is kind of what happened 4 years ago. Right? Democratic voters were so unenthusiastic about Clinton that they just stayed home. And that just wasn't true this time.
What do you think of the argument that, and I kind of want to come back to the general polarization of the left-right dynamics and whether antagonism towards both the left and the right is being used to justify, fairly heinous stuff, both in our politics and potentially in the future of our politics. I kind of want to come back to that, but at least for now, what do you think about the idea that they're not distinguishing their platforms from each other sufficiently on policies? They're both fairly similar if you look at historically the range of opinions permissible in society. It's just that people are so antagonistic towards the other side. It's not that they're fighting for something on their side. It's that they have been trained to so hate the other side that's why they came out. I mean, is there something to that, or where would you take that, Dr.
It's utterly tribal.
Yeah, I think there is something to that, but we have to always ask these deeper questions about, why has it come to this, right? Why are people so susceptible to, interested in the extreme arguments. And I think that part of that is deep insecurity, that there's a real sense that the country's in crisis and that people don't see how we can move forward. And they don't see the middle as offering them anything. A kind of pro-corporate, business as usual approach just doesn't seem appealing. So I think that's the dilemma we're in.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, but back during, I guess my thing is, back during the FDR period, FDR moved heaven and earth. I mean, you would have thought that this country was under some kind of alien invasion in the way FDR was behaving. And you get to now, and it's not there. Meaning, when I'm looking at our history and I try to figure out, all right, this is a crisis. You have all sorts of things on fire. And I mean, sometimes literally, and other things figuratively. Like for example, you mentioned climate change. That's something that we don't entirely pay attention to. All incentives from the standpoint of financial go against doing anything about. And both political parties are basically beholden, despite the rhetoric, are beholden to the same industries, with a modicum of change that the Democrats are willing to do for the standpoint of let's say solar power or something to that effect. I guess it feels like our politics are so remote from reality, and that there is this distinction between what the public wants. I mean, you can go down the list. I've gone down the list many times, showing that this is what the public wants. This is the middle of the country. And then you look at the political parties, and they're nowhere near it. They're nowhere near it. Now, the question is why? And I think that's the most interesting question. Why is there this great chasm between what the public wants versus what the political instrument gives? Because I agree with you, but I don't think enthusiasm is entirely there just because they love the candidates. Enthusiasm could also be there, just like Shane was saying, out of this competitive aspect of, I want to get this guy out of office, or I want to keep this guy in office.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that, but I think there are two things to look at here. One is that, when you think back to FDR was pushed by a kind of existential crisis, which is not just that the economy was a mess, but there were active left-wing movements. There was a socialist and communist labor movement that was on his heels. This was not that long after the Russian Revolution, right, where these left movements were ascendant. And so there was a real sense in which if they didn't take massive steps to reform capitalism, that there would be a fundamental threat to capitalism. And that just isn't true right now. There are threats from the right as well as from the left. And, if you just look at the labor movement today compared to the labor movement then, right, we have this disempowered labor movement with very little political analysis. All the radicals have been driven out or silenced. And so it's just a different environment. The other factor number two, is the role of big money in politics. So both parties are dependent upon the millionaire and billionaire class to finance the media buys and the ad strategies. And so this is causing them to mute their politics.
Well, I mean, you mean mutate? Like they basically
that
lean,
too.
they lean towards the cash. That's what you're saying.
Yes, they lean towards the cash. That's right, and that's clear that what Biden understood, that he got the money to beat Sanders and the political support because they don't want to have that politics. They don't want to have that democratic socialist politics. So, and he is the candidate that can deliver on that absence of any kind of real program.
And I guess that's unfortunate. Like there is look, I know when I say this, it's extremely naive, and I don't entirely believe politicians think in these terms. But I am thinking in these terms. With all of the things that avail us, this election, I strongly suspect that if you look at the DSA, for example, the Democratic Socialists of America cleaned up. I took the thing down, but they won like 20-something seats. I think they might have only lost like 2 seats. And the items that they put up, either whether it was drug decriminalization or whatever else, won. That means that the public was craving this stuff.
Yeah.
And Biden.
Yes, they've shown real advances, and I think we should be looking to support that wholeheartedly.
I see the DSA doing extremely well. I see Biden talking about a beat the socialists. I see him not going with the idea of legalizing cannabis. I see him saying, I'm not going to defund the police and attacking these groups. And then on election night, razor thin margins. And then you look at the DSA, you look at drug legalization, and those things went through the roof. And you think to yourself, is it possible that he left money on the table because he wasn't willing to go in routes that the public wanted? Let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Our guest is Dr. Alex Vitale, professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College and visiting professor at London South Bank University. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9.
No Dan just yet. Still getting Dan.
Find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And we're waiting for our next guest to come on, but we've got a couple of minutes here. If you'd like to try giving us a call, 202-521-1320 is the number. Interesting show so far, Jamarl. And again, for the audience, if you'd like to give us a call, our phone lines are open, 202-521-1320. And you know what? I'm going to do this too. It's been a little while since we've done this. If you guys live in the DC area, you can catch us on the radio there at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We are also on in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also, if you're digging what Jamarl and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, please give up a like and or a share of the video or the audio. We're on twitter.com/faultlinesradio. We're on YouTube. Just do a search for Jamarl Thomas. Usually our Fault Lines radio channel is up, but for some reason this morning we're having problems still looking into those. But regardless, if you go over to that channel, you can subscribe. We are also on audio options, including the Sputnik app, Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, and Spotify. And I believe I already mentioned that one, actually. But yeah, we're also taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. I wish... we had Dr. Alex Vitale on just now. Wish we'd gotten into this other side of it. Haven't been talking about this much, which is, fears of a contested election, fears of where this thing is going to go on the other side of an election that is getting increasingly critical, and where that's going to lead the public. Like whether they're going to see serious civil unrest, violence in the streets, surpassing the levels of violence that we saw earlier this summer. That was certainly the fear, but so far none of that has come to pass. Would have been an interesting conversation. To have the other side of that conversation, we're joined now by Danny Scherzen. You can find Danny on Twitter at Skeptical Vet. He's a retired U.S. Army officer, director of the New Eisenhower Media Network, senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, and contributing editor at antiwar.com. And by the way, he is also the author of 2 books, Ghostwriters of Baghdad and Patriotic Dissent, America in the Age of Endless War. Danny, thank you for being with us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good. Managing to keep busy and try to follow all of this. And man, there's just a lot going on. But like you mentioned, so far so good in terms of level of unrest. So let's hope that keeps up.
Fingers crossed on that one. Before we get into it, I want to check in with you. The new Eisenhower Media Network, EMN. Can you please tell us a little bit about this? What is this?
Right. So basically, we've gathered together an initial crop of senior fellows who are various levels of national security veterans, mostly military, but we also have FBI, people who work to counter terror, all of whom are independent, nonpartisan, basically transpartisan from across the divide, but skeptical, critical of, U.S. military-industrial complex and forever war policy. And so we're going to kind of gather them together and work to focus our efforts to get into media, get as many of these faces, some of whom we've seen before, right? Some of whom are fairly prominent. Colonel Larry Wilkerson has been on a lot of shows over the years, Colin Powell's chief of staff, but a lot of other voices who are highly kind of esteemed with the great platform of their credibility in military service, getting them into as much media as possible. So taking all these veterans who exist, who've been critical of these wars and this overall foreign policy, and streamlining them and kind of focusing in one direction and rowing together, sort of, and trying to get the message out as best as we can. So we're excited, and you'll be seeing more from us around Veterans Day, depending on how things go here with the election.
Larry Wilkerson is an interesting cat. I used to watch him on Real News Network, and I used to really enjoy his analysis of politics. I'm curious, was he, and this is kind of a question, I guess, for you too, was he changed from the time he got out of military? Meaning, when he was in the military, did he have a certain point of view that changed when he got out of the military? Did his vantage point, to some degree, shift? Because he seemed to be, like, what he says now on Real News Network or over the last few years, I don't know. It's counterintuitive in regards to what you would expect in a Bush White House, even if it is under Colin Powell's office. So is this one of those things where when people get out of the military, there's a certain point of view change? I mean, granted, people can change their point of view at any particular point in time, but I guess I'm asking maybe in the majority per se. Or was this a point of view that he held when he was in office in the same way that many other people have these points of view in office that tend to trend towards less conflict?
Well, I'm paraphrasing here, but Andrew Bacevich, who's another sort of critical former military guy, written a whole lot of books. He made a quip in one of his early books that I read that essentially said that he never had an original thought or something until he got out of the military, and he was purposely being self-deprecating. I don't want to speak for Larry, but I will say that just based on our conversation, what's public record, actually he was very critical internally of the Bush administration from the first, it sounds like, especially right after 9/11. But he was working within the system, which almost everyone on our network, right, in the EMN, myself included, we all tried, right? Every one of us was at some point there was a gradual and then usually a quickened by events, especially around the Iraq invasion, skepticism, critique, and worry. And so then I think the first instinct is to work within the system that you've been in and your identity has been molded by. So someone like Larry had been in the U.S. military since Vietnam, I believe 1966. So by the time the Bush administration comes around, he's nearly 40 years into his public service in the military and now the State Department. So the issue, I think that what you see now, and just, as I've followed his appearances now for 15 years that I've really been following him, I think that, and I believe he would tell you that his critique got more and more systemic, broader in its, in its kind of analysis, because I think when you become the lone voice or one of the few voices in a place like the Bush administration, where you're not even fully able to convince your own boss, let alone, right the ship, when everyone else is essentially a company man, right? So they're either believers, right, of the Cheney mold, the neocons, or they're company men who this is what they do. They don't really question it. They may say something to their wife at home, but then they go to work the next day and make it happen. And I think that can be a real paradigm shift ethically and intellectually, which can lead to now one leaves the military and the filter's not there. So the private conversations and the private doubts become the public critique. And I think that they've generally evolved. You know, people would say, oh, this person, whether it's Larry or me or something, has gotten more radical. I reject that. I think that what we would say is our critique got more systemic. We started to talk about empire, not just, you know, how do we fix this war around the margins.
Before we move on, you know, this is actually a pretty natural pivot, but we highlight the fact that you have Eisenhower Media Network. Where can people find that? The website, anywhere that people can check out what you guys have been putting out?
Yeah, we're going to have a website probably launching in around Veterans Day, EisenhowerMediaNetwork.com. We've got all that. You'll see social media. There's going to be a launch push of op-eds, and it'll always be in my bio line. So yeah, simple Google or hitting the website. But we'll put out a launch notice, and so you'll see it. But we're looking at Veterans Day as an official, coming out party, I guess.
Coming up pretty soon here. Yeah, coming up, I believe, next week. Also, just real quick, best place right now, would that be fortressonahill.com?
Yeah, fortressonahill.com is my podcast website. And then to find any of my work, skepticalvet.com, kind of everything that I do ends up there. It's a one-stop shop. So anything I publish or appear on is on that website. It kind of ends up there.
Okay. All right. You see what I'm trying to do there. Thank you again for that. You guys were talking about Lawrence Wilkerson, Larry Wilkerson. You also briefly mentioned Real News Network. Danny, I saw you being interviewed on that network the other night, and you're talking about interesting stuff. This was in advance of the election. I believe this was the night before the election that you did this interview. You were talking about the possible scenarios in which different branches of the military may decide to get involved in a post-election. I don't know exactly what word to use, so I'll just use the word coup, something like that, something approaching that, where you have, again, the military deciding to get involved, a bunch of stuff. So this is the ultimate, as far as I can tell, the ultimate backstop for civil unrest and for the election in general. You have the Supreme Court, which is where it seems things are going to get pushed now in terms of voter fraud, deciding how votes will be recounted, whether they will. But failing that, the ultimate backstop is the military. I don't think things are going there. It seems like things are relatively pacific, but I thought it was an interesting conversation. It's also an interesting lens to use to look at the way the military works. One of the things I heard you saying the other night that I thought was interesting was that the military is not a monolith. The military is diverse. There are differences between the opinions, the political perspectives of the rank and file and of the leadership. Could you go into that? What is this, not the sort of organizational structure, but what is the political structure in terms of the beliefs, and how do you think those would affect people who are making relevant decisions about whether or not to get involved in post-election strife of the highest level? Danny?
Yeah, the first thing is the Real News interview you're talking about, to show you how toxic social media can be. The title they came up with is something like military options if Trump won't leave. And so folks didn't watch the 20-minute interview. They just saw the title, and they assumed that I was cheering in some way the idea that the military should step in and that I'm hoping for that. And, of course, the first thing I want to say is throughout that interview and everything I've kind of written, I believe this should be seen as a massive last resort and one that would have permanent ramifications, negative ones, on Americans' trust, like in the military and its lack of politicization. This is a nightmare scenario, and luckily it does not look like it's going that way. However, what I was trying to point out was sort of wargaming, options, possibilities. How would this go? And I sought to complicate this notion because I saw a lot of breezy and sort of offhanded, almost cheering, especially from the establishment left, ideas that the military's with us. For once, finally, the military's with the left, with the liberals. And if Trump wants to be a monster, then they'll come move him. I think that's very, very disturbing. And not because I don't think the military could have a role in a crisis, but because I don't think we should be hoping for it. The reason I sought to complicate it was to show yes, the military is not a monolith. And so one way to look at that is in, say, the 1990s.
Real quick, I just want to pause you. I can see this is coming across as very confusing for listeners. When you say complicate, I don't think you mean obscure. I think you mean there's a little bit more nuance than most people see here. So I want to get into the details. Is that kind of the sense in which you're using that word?
That's right. Yeah, I guess I mean in sort of an academic sense. So, I mean, I want to show that this isn't simple. This is something that we are not looking at a military that is just a conservative institution. We're not looking at a military that just likes Trump or just dislikes Trump. What I'm saying is that the military is like America in the sense that it's divided. It is unlike America in the sense that it is to some extent skewed demographically towards certain areas. And it is also very stratified by what one might call class, which is also similar to America. And so, what I'm saying is this idea that the military is with, Biden, or that the military dislikes Trump may be true to some extent among, say, the senior officers. Right? There are a lot of senior retired and even sort of active officers who've made it clear that they're not fans of this president per se, for a lot of reasons, good and bad. What I was trying to challenge was this idea that the military was a monolith in either direction, because the rank and file, the enlisted soldier, the lower, the junior officers, especially in the combat units, which tend to be whiter, more southern, and more mountain western, statistically, and male, actually aren't so anti-Trump. In fact, there's a lot of sentiment of positivity. So what I was saying is, if this were to happen,
wait, Danny, we've got to go into a break. But that is an interesting point. It begs the question of what would happen if there were some decision on a high level to get involved in the election, like whether you'd see a mutiny on the low levels. I'm curious to hear your take on that. But we've got to go into a break. We are joined by Danny Schurzan, retired U.S. Army officer, director of the new upcoming Eisenhower Media Network, senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, and contributing editor at antiwar.com. Follow him on Twitter at SkepticalVet. We'll be back with him on the other side of this break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and our guest, Danny Schurzan, retired U.S. Army officer, director of the new Eisenhower Media Network, senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, and contributing editor at antiwar.com. He is the author of 2 books, Ghostwriters of Baghdad and Patriotic Dissent, America in the Age of Endless War. And you can follow him on Twitter at Skeptical Vet, and you can and should check out his podcast, Fortress on a Hill, co-hosted with fellow vet Chris Henry Henriksen, over at fortressonahill.com. You can check that out. Danny, thank you again for being with us. I'm gonna bring us back in just real quick. Would that be a mutiny? I mean, you were going somewhere with it. I didn't mean to cut you off, so feel free to get back into that. But what would that look like? You're talking about a discrepancy between the political views held by the higher ups in the military and those held by the rank and file. What would that process look like if push comes to shove? Not to be too crude about it, what does that turn into?
It's hard to predict exactly how this would go down. I mean, the pivotal question is the extent to which the military would be, and this is always the dilemma, to what extent would they foreground the first part of their oath, which is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and to what extent would they prioritize the second part of their initial oath, which is, to follow the orders of their superior officers and the President of the United States. So the oath is clear about which is the primary. However, in practice, this can get messy. And my point about not taking this lightly is that we don't really want to know necessarily. We don't want to put this to the test, because what I fear, and I've criticized this for years, is that the all-volunteer force, our professionalized military, which has become increasingly divided from the American people, increasingly demographically looks different, and increasingly has become sort of a Praetorian Guard. I don't think that we are ready as a society to see its divisions and its contradictions and its limitations come to the fore. And so one of those is that the combat units, the infantry units, for example, are far wider, like I said, far more Southern, far more Mountain Western, and to some extent, because of that, probably far more populist conservative than, say, their senior officers. And I'm not saying that they wouldn't necessarily follow the orders of the officers, and I think if I had a gun in my head, I would say that the military would essentially hew towards the Constitution. However, there would be costs, because the military right now is the only respected public institution in America. It is the only public institution of government that has more than 50% support of its people. That's disturbing in a republic, but it's the facts. If the military were to be seen to take sides in this, then half of America would lose a lot of that faith, because we are so tribal. And I do think it would put to test the extent to which this military looks like and holds to the values of all of America, because it is not demographically, it is not proportional. And so, I just think that the all-volunteer force has always had these contradictions, and even the speculation of how it would play a domestic role in a contested election is actually fairly instructive, because it does lay out and expose a lot of these flaws.
Yeah, I got to be honest, that's a terrifying idea. Even talking about this is terrifying. I don't want the military intruding into domestic politics. I mean, imagine what that means. And how do you put Humpty Dumpty back together again the moment that it breaks? I don't think we've fully grasped the gravity of something like that in the United States. We've been so familiar with having one candidate concede. It's me, I failed, I failed miserably. I couldn't win it. I couldn't get the public. The public hates me. So I'm, shaking this guy's hand and he's going to be president. And when you don't have that and you get this fight and you get one side saying, oh, the election is rigged. And you get a bunch of lemmings and sycophants screaming, oh yeah, the election is rigged. Not because it is, but because they just don't want to concede, knowing that there are certain loopholes that they can try to get around doing. I think all of this is terrifying in regards to reality. And I've heard some Democrats saying that the military was on their side, or these guys acting like the CIA and whatnot are somehow on their sides. That would be a disastrous outcome if it was a military junta take place in the U.S. Because you're right. Hillary Clinton had like a 70% approval rating when she was Secretary of State. The moment Hillary Clinton got involved in politics, that number plummeted. And I strongly suspect when the United States is involved and they see their military up close doing the type of things that they do abroad, I don't think that over 50% will remain. I mean, we have people who are complaining about masks. When you're getting into this kind of, military taking over politics, I think that's disastrous. I don't know how you put that back together again. Am I wrong in this, Danny?
No, I mean, the fact that we have felt the need, and I never thought it was likely that this was going to happen, but I thought there was an enormous risk that if it did, there would be catastrophic circumstances, which in the military planning model of risk, the risk assessment, that still comes out as high risk, right? So if there's a low to modest possibility, but there's a severe outcome if it does happen, they still assess that as high risk. But I think the fact that we're even having this conversation is disturbing. It sounds a lot like we're talking about, quote, a third world country now, doesn't it? I mean, this conversation when I was a child, right? Like when I was, in the late 80s and the early 90s, for all the scandals of Iran-Contra and then eventually Monica Lewinsky, right? All of that never rose to the level, really, of discussing tanks in the streets, for lack of a better word, proverbially or actually. And, I'm a big film buff, and there was a very prescient film, The Siege, from 1998, which just depicted, the military responding to terrorist attacks in Brooklyn. And they asked the general about whether the military should be brought in. And initially he says that the army is a broadsword, not a scalpel. And trust me, Senator, you don't want the army in an American city. And then after he describes what it would look like, he talks about the infantry and the tanks and all that. And then he says, he ends by saying there'll be tanks, and then, of course, there'll be the ubiquitous assault rifle, a humble enough weapon until you see it in the hands of a man outside your local bowling alley or 7-Eleven. It will be noisy, it will be scary, and it will not be mistaken for a VFW parade. And I think that's the point that you're raising.
It's bizarre to see it. Like when you're abroad and you see people walking around with those heavy machinery, like heavy weapons, it is unnerving, to put it mildly. So, yeah, I don't want to see that on American streets.
Absolutely.
Third world country with nukes. I mean, you bringing up the fact that, our politics resembles that of a declined or a degraded state, at which it obviously is. But we have, along with Russia, the most nukes in the world. So I don't know if, I'm going to come back to this, actually. It's in some sense a dead end. You were saying something on Real News Network. You were talking about, you just used the phrase again. I'm going to quote here. "We are going to have to revisit whether we want a Praetorian Guard or a citizen soldiery or something in between." That's you, I'm quoting. "But right now we are pretty far out on the margins," end quote. This is again from your interview on Real News Network the other night. What are those margins? What is the Praetorian Guard for people who aren't familiar, and what margin are you talking about? Where are we?
So when the Roman Republic becomes the Roman Empire, which was the obsession of the founding fathers, of many of them, they were worried about how do you keep a republic, right? How do you avoid becoming an empire? Because they like to read Romans. One of the problems was that the legions, right, the army divisions essentially became more and more professionalized soldiers rather than citizen soldiers, and they became less and less representative of the Italian peninsula's citizenry, and then they eventually became something like mercenaries, and in the process they became highly politicized. So they were either the emperor's personal tool rather than the people's personal, sort of representative military, and sometimes they turned on the emperors, right? And so this is the idea that I'm talking about when I say Praetorian Guard. When we got rid of the draft, we got rid of the notion of the citizen soldier. So now you have 1% of Americans who serve, and oh, by the way, the Americans who serve, they don't look like us. Okay, they don't look proportional, so they tend to be slightly poorer. They tend to be definitely more rural, deep south, mountain west, and Rust Belt. And in the combat units, in the infantry, in the artillery, they tend to be far whiter. Okay, and sort of from these areas, and so, and they're professionalized, right? They don't rotate in and out of society the same way as like draftees or a citizen soldier, and so they live separately on these bases that are usually very far from major metropolitan areas. Especially they are not so much on the coast in the polite establishment cities, and so. Look, I just think that when we did that, we not only shifted the burden off of the American people for our wars, which made it easier to go to war, but we inherently created this situation of a politicization. We just didn't talk about it in polite company until Trump was president, and now suddenly it's out in the open. And I think that that's why this conversation, the fact that we're having it, is very disturbing. And it should lead us to take a hard look at that all-volunteer force and how we want to field and populate our military.
So should we reinstitute the draft? Is that what you're saying? That's what it sounds like you're saying. I mean, it sounds like you're saying that basically 1% of our population is in the military, that we have the president's men, where the president basically can send these guys out to war, and it doesn't affect the rest of the population. So the rest of the population continues to play their Xbox and, get their pizza, get their hamburgers, and go on with their business, and don't pay attention to what is taking place around the world in this front. Is the draft the answer?
I'm very much of two minds about this. In many cases, I've said that bringing back the draft is like my nuclear option to end the endless wars, because the idea that if every American mother had to wake up and wonder if her senior in high school was at risk of being drafted and sent to a silly war in Iraq, maybe she'd pay attention, right, to the newspaper, and maybe she would concern herself with foreign policy. So in one sense, I think it could have benefits. However, I also have my doubts about it. I mean, this idea of the state having that kind of control and taking away bodily autonomy, right, of individuals is problematic as well. So maybe some form of national service, right, some sort of lottery national service without deferments would be a better way. I think we should at least be having the discussion of what happens when wars can be waged without congressional approval and without any overt or direct effect on the American people, because we don't even have a war tax, let alone a war tax in blood, which is what a draft would do by spreading it widely if we had no deferments that allowed the rich to get out of it, which usually there are those things. So, in many ways, I'm speculating in a very hypothetical sense. I think that we should at least relook the way we populate and use our military accordingly.
Andy, here's what truly worries me, even about the idea of bringing back a draft. What if it's drones? What if people aren't having to face the price themselves, but what you have is a sort of mass conscripted army of people flying drones? I know that might seem a little bit far afield in some sense, but legitimately the nature of war has shifted, over the past century. Air power has become the thing, as far as I can tell. Air and naval power. It's not boots on the ground. It's drones in the sky, so to speak. And I'm worried about what a draft would look like if people didn't actually have to pay the price, but they just sort of lived out the video game. In any event, topic for another time. We were joined there by Danny Schurzan, retired U.S. Army officer. Follow him at Skeptical Vet. Check out his work, antiwar.com, skepticalvet.com, and fortressonahill.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be back with headlines in just a minute.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it is time for our last hour this week of the most disruptive show in global politics and current events in the independent corner. I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, of course with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together on that wall, peering out into the gloomy darkness, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And without further ado, let's get into the news. First up in the headlines this morning, well, Joe Biden now has 253 Electoral College votes, while Republican Mr. Trump, that's President Trump, has 214 to win the White House. A candidate needs 270. In addition to the state of Georgia, counts are continuing in 4 states with razor-thin margins: Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, and North Carolina. Trump must win Georgia to leave him with a path to the win. According to the most recent data there, Mr. Biden is leading in the state by 917, with most votes there now counted. With its 16 electoral votes, winning the state, Georgia that is, would put Joe Biden just one electoral vote shy of the crucial 270 threshold needed to win the presidency. If Mr. Trump does not win Georgia, the most electoral college votes he could possibly get is 269, which would leave the candidates in an unprecedented draw. No news organization has yet projected the state as a Biden win. Authorities in the state have said they hope to have results today. And by the way, Biden, according to CNN, according to a CNN projection, a projection, what is that worth? We'll see. Biden has pulled ahead of Trump in Pennsylvania. If he has, it's over. At least according to the news media narrative. But what was that, Jamarl? I think you may be muted. I heard you jump in for a second.
Oh, I'm sorry. It says right here, I'm reading New York Times. It says, with a tally of Friday morning, about 31,000 votes from Philadelphia, which voted overwhelmingly for Joe Biden, he pulled ahead of Trump by 5,587 votes in Philly. That's amazing. If that's true, this is over.
These are crazy. Yeah, if it's true, this is over. But those are just tiny margins. Less than 1,000 votes in Georgia, 5,000 votes in Pennsylvania. It's very small. It's very close. I mean, even here's the thing. Yeah, coming back to Caleb Maupin, we were talking with Caleb Maupin on our special election night coverage during that coverage. And what he was saying was, even if Trump loses, even if Biden wins, it's so darn close. It's a complete defiance. Completely defies expectations, completely breaks the establishment's predictions on this stuff. Who are we left to trust? That fundamentally is the thing. The assumption here is that the establishment fooled itself again into thinking that there would be a landslide. Even if they win by that thin margin, they don't have a mandate and they don't have Congress. They don't have the Senate by all appearances. Things. We'll see what happens with the 2 Georgia runoffs, assuming they, we'll see how that goes. But it doesn't seem like they're going to take a majority in the Senate right now.
What terrifies me.
Yeah.
What terrifies me, Shane, is that Biden and Mitch McConnell are close. Like, these guys aren't that drastically different in regards to what they want, in regards to what they push for. So will the Mitch McConnell Senate work with the Joe Biden presidency? And what does it mean if that answer is yes? Because Mitch McConnell is only going to work on things that Mitch McConnell wants to get done. And it's already been talked about in the media that Biden has been willing to work with McConnell, even from the standpoint of the picks that he's bringing into his administration. Now, I think this is more like, oh, don't hold me back. And there's nobody, where Biden wants to go in a particular direction anyway, McConnell gives him the excuse. Now, I think this is going to be disastrous.
More war. Yeah, more war, more death. That's ultimately the bottom line here. Is I fear that we're going towards a presidency, a Biden presidency, with new international engagements, possibly a war with a major, in another major country like Russia or China. That's the major fear here. And again, with our political system so degraded, and the fact that we have so many nukes, I don't like this stuff. Anyway, I think we should get back into the headlines before my head starts to explode. Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook took action against the account of Steve Bannon's podcast on Thursday evening after the former White House chief strategist called for the beheading of Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's top infectious disease expert. You heard that right. Former Trump campaign chair Steve Bannon, in a video, called for the beheading for the heads of Fauci and FBI Director Christopher Wray to be displayed on pikes in front of the White House, quote, as a warning to federal bureaucrats, end quote. Twitter said that it had permanently suspended the account War Room Pandemic for violating its policy against glorifying violence. Well, yeah. YouTube said it took down the video for breaking rules against inciting violence and issued a strike against the account. Under the Google-owned video platform's 3 strikes policy, the offender cannot upload videos for at least a week after the violation. Facebook, which Bannon used to live stream the podcast, said it removed 2 videos from his official page for breaking rules around inciting violence. Here's the thing. I actually haven't heard the clip myself. I tried to hear it on YouTube, but you couldn't hear the clip because obviously YouTube pulled the clip. If you were to hear the relevant segment, then you can't do that. They don't want that up on their platform. Anyway, I kind of wanted to hear the context for it. I still haven't heard that. 2 thoughts here come to mind, and I want to hear your take, Jamarl. One thought is Bannon did this intentionally in order to get banned so he could cry foul. And the second thought is I still don't want them banning him for it. Unless he's literally encouraging people to do this, I still don't think they should be banning him for it. I know that might seem extreme. I don't, but just to be clear, I don't want Fauci or Chris Wray dead. That's far from it. Fauci seems like a nice dude. I'm not going to speak much for Chris Wray, but broadly, I'm opposed to the death penalty. So just to be clear, that is not where I'm going. But I just don't like the whole social media censorship thing, man. What's your take, though, Jamarl?
I don't want them to really behead Fauci, but by the same token, I don't want the censorship. Reality gives us no outs on this, and I struggle with this one because my first thought is, I don't like the censorship. I don't want them telling people to not do X or to not do Y. But I can clearly think of situations where I would be like, oh, that seems to go beyond the pale. And if it was my company, I wouldn't want that on my site. Like, for example, would I want somebody on my site saying, hey, let's go kill this person? No. As a fail, that seems outright as a fail. By the same token, if you're saying I'm free speech extremist where everything is permitted, then that's permitted also. So if we agree that there's a line, then where's the line? And that's what makes it so hard. Because at that point, we're fighting over subjectivity. And that's not necessarily the easiest way to go about this stuff. From my standpoint, I don't like the censorship, but I don't know what Bannon said. And in a country of 300 million people, are there some people who are not wrapped that tight that are listening to Bannon that may take that legit? By the same token, do you need Bannon to tell people to do that? as opposed to Trump, attacking Fauci, or these other Republicans on Fox News attacking Fauci. I don't know. I don't like the censorship. No, I don't. But at the same token, I also don't want anyone on social media saying go murder this person because they don't like their political instincts. As much as I dislike Trump, you've never heard me say off or cut Trump's head off. And so the idea that they're even using this type of language towards Fauci just seems to be hyperbolic or hysterical at least. So yeah, I don't know the context. I don't know how Bannon said it. I mean, if it was this kind of backhand remark, then no. And because of social media, you don't even know. Like, it could have been an offhand comment that didn't necessarily have the context that we were giving it. So it's hard to know. But I don't know, man. This stuff gets difficult to pull off. Or it gets difficult because there are legitimately bad outcomes sometimes, depending upon what people are telling other people to do. By the same token, where do you draw the line from the standpoint of speech and this kind of, expectation of individuals to have some kind of sense of mind not to do any insane things? I don't know where that line is.
Well, so here's the thing, though. I mean, one of the first things you said is that, would you want to have this speech on your platform? That's the thing. Is this their platform? And I don't mean that in the whole we should nationalize it sense, but like ostensibly the internet as such, let alone the specific platforms that inhabit it, was built on these ideals of free participation and open public discourse and all that stuff. Now, admittedly, that's a gauzy ideal. And I'm not saying that that's the reality, but like, shouldn't they try to live up to that? Shouldn't they try to hold themselves to some higher standard than just fear of prosecution or fear of persecution by the government, which is frankly what it seems to come down to, is them being afraid of either Republicans or Democrats pushing back on them too hard for permitting this stuff? I mean, mostly the Democrats, of course, to be clear, especially in this election cycle. Is that too naive or idealistic of me, Jamarl?
Yes. Maybe. I mean, it depends. Like, if you had a website, if you owned a site, let's say it was called Stranahan.com, whatever it is, and you had people on your site, and you had a group that just migrated to your site, and these guys were hardcore, let's go out and lynch, I don't know, little people. I don't know why. They're just, they hate little people for some reason. Maybe.
What do you have against little people?
Right, exactly. It's just a weird thing.
Where's
Are you going to be okay with that on your platform? Are you going to be like, all right, I'm going to let these guys get their free speech in attacking and talking about stringing up little people? Are you going to have some feelings about that?
I think there's some class consciousness thing going on, because I think we're both relatively tall. You're like, what, 6'1", something like that, right?
Yeah. Right. No, I'm not saying really do that.
I'm 6
But you know
foot.
what I mean? I'm making the point that if you have somebody who migrated on your site that's just hateful for whatever particular reason, would you be okay with that?
No, I hear
if
you.
that goes against your own political ideology. You're not a hateful person.
Well, but here's the. Well, maybe I am. No, I'm just kidding. No, I try not to be. But no, here's the thing. It's social media. I mean, it's easy to gloss over the phrase social media because that's the term that we use, and if overuse sort of breeds familiarity, that you kind of blind yourself to the fundamental aspects of something. But what is social media? It mediates society, frankly. It is the technological interlacing of all our interactions with each other on the purest level in our digital era or whatever. This is how we communicate by and large. That's no small task. That's no small responsibility. They should be living up to the mantle that comes with that responsibility. They should be acting fairly. They should not be trying to suppress certain beliefs unless they're literally unless it violates free speech in our society legally.
I didn't hear an answer, Shane.
What's the answer?
I didn't hear an answer. Are you at ShaneStranahan.com? A group migrates saying they're going to string up little people. Is Shane Stranahan going to stop them from talking about stringing up little people, or is that going to be the area that people can come and talk about that stuff?
If they're planning, yes. If they're planning on stringing up little people, if they're organizing, if there's a conspiracy in the midst, then yeah, I'll shut that down. But if they're just talking about it, then I don't know. Maybe my site becomes the place where they come and do that. And admittedly, that's not a pretty picture. But I also don't know that that's the destiny for Facebook or Twitter.
But that's
I don't
what
think
I mean.
that's what's necessarily going to happen.
Is that comfortable? Even if you're saying, God, man, I don't want to have to.
I would take it.
You take it?
I will bite that bullet, man. I will let that happen.
Fair enough.
Because
fair enough.
Because here's what happens. Again, unless it's literally a threat, which again, that's not free speech. You're making a threat that you can be held for that. Unless you're threatening somebody, literally, unless there's an explicit intent and you're stating that intent, etc. What happens is people just distance themselves from the crazies who are over there talking about stringing up little people. And again, I want to distance myself from that pretty sharply too. But that is what happens, That's how society works, frankly. We should just let society work. That's my take.
I love these border questions, because I think the border questions get reality. I think that hits it far better than what's in the middle. Like something that everybody agrees on. It's not interesting. Something where you get to that rim. Like if you start talking about, like, is it okay to eat? Why is it not okay to eat human beings? But you can eat animals. And it's like, well, wait a minute. I mean, human beings, they can think, etc. It's like, well, yeah, but that animal thing, like you get into these kind of edges of conversation. I think sometimes these give a clarity to our reality in a way that other stuff doesn't. I'm fascinated by these type of conversations. But I'm sorry, keep going.
Oh man, no, we do not have enough time for headlines. We have been hopelessly derailed. It's another. What is that? Oh my gosh, why am I even forgetting this? The train track. You're talking about like logical border questions, and then of course there's a trolley problem.
You're thinking of the trolley problem.
What I'm talking about.
It's like if there's one guy on the track, but you have to pull a lever, and it's going to kill two. Would you do it? That type of stuff. And then the question becomes, well, is it on your conscience? What if it's a chubby guy on the track? What if it's somebody like all of these? What if it's a cancer patient? Do you still pull the trolley lever to kill a patient?
You pulled the lever, Jamarl. You pulled the lever. You decided to have a conversation, an incredibly controversial conversation, in order to save those next 5 headlines that we were going to be getting into. That was the moral side of the dynamic that you fell down on. With that, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And we are going into a break. that was a good one. All right. That was a fun conversation, fun back and forth there, Jamarl. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this break with Nico House. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and our guest for this segment and the next, Nico House. He is a political activist and broadcast journalist, founder and CEO of the MCSC Network. And by the way, I'm just going to get this all out front here because I really do want it right out front. You can follow Nico on Twitter at NicoCSFB. You can follow the Mikasa Sukasa Network on Twitter at MCSC Network. And you can watch their videos on YouTube by searching for MCSC Network with Nico House. Nico, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing fantastic, gentlemen. How about yourselves?
I'm great. Jamarl, how about you?
So far, so good. Welcome to the show, man.
Good to hear.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, let's get right into it. Election shenanigans. I saw you doing a video the other night. I thought it would be an interesting conversation, and our producers thought the same, because when I asked them to see if we could book you, you were already booked. And thank you for joining us. Specifically, a couple different states we could talk about here, but let's focus on Wisconsin. Going around the other night, and this has been a matter of some dispute on the various sort of media truth determining networks like PolitiFact, et cetera. Michigan and Wisconsin, these two states with sudden jumps in vote counts. Michigan was chalked up to a misrepresentation in the database or something like this. Wisconsin is a little bit more complicated. I'm going to let you take it over. You were noticing some interesting discrepancies and some interesting patterns in terms of the number of registered voters when they came in, how many there were, and then the total voter turnout. But I'm gonna turn it over to you. You've been paying attention to this stuff more closely than I have. What's been going on in Wisconsin, Nico?
So I gotta thank my fan base for constantly updating me with this stuff, because I literally could not keep up with all of it even if I wanted to. But someone sent me an article where a local Milwaukee publication caught straight from the secretary's website that there was reporting of 200%, 203%, 204% turnout in certain wards of Milwaukee. And this is straight out of the website from the Secretary of State. Okay. Now, this wasn't November 3rd because the first argument everyone wants to make, of course, is, well, no, same day registration. And I got some bad news for everybody. Even in 2016, where there was would be what would be a considerably high turnout for Hillary Clinton in that area, they only had in the entire state of of Wisconsin, 60,000 new registrations that day. So yeah, no, that's excuses out the window. But in this particular publication, it was updated November 4th after the votes had been counted in Milwaukee, and there was 200% turnout. Now, the article then, of course, went viral, and then apparently somebody made a phone call because immediately at yesterday around 3:59, according to the article, 3:59 p.m. Eastern time, they made updates to the update. Now, usually when you're talking about a chronological update in the middle of an election, the numbers go up, right? Yeah, except for both Biden and Trump lost hundreds of votes, hundreds for each ward. And now, once again, this is at about 3:59 p.m. Eastern, and Wisconsin was declared for Biden well before that yesterday. Presumably based off of those numbers, the original numbers.
But how do you reconcile same-day registration? Meaning it's one thing to say, well, there seem to be more registered voters. It's another thing to say, well, Wisconsin has same-day registration, meaning whoever comes can register on the day that they come to register to vote. I'm not seeing...
This was on November. The 200% turnout was reported. It was the official report after the voting had concluded on November the 4th, updated on November the 4th. You get what I'm saying? They voted on November the 3rd.
Nico, what I'm getting at is if anybody, any random person, let's say 1,000 people, as long as they're a resident of the United States, they go to a voting booth in Wisconsin, they can register on that day and vote. Even if you have 500% increase in people who are coming to Wisconsin to vote, they can do so.
This isn't an increase. This isn't an increase. What I'm saying is, for example, in Ward 263, there were about 622 registered voters. 670 of them voted for Joe Biden. And then another 300 or 400 voted for Trump. You see the problem here? This is on November the 4th, not the 3rd. So in other words, there is already the newly registered voters are already accounted for. And when all of those, and even still, because I understand what you're saying, then when those voters are finally accounted for, the new registrations are finally accounted for, say it just forgot to put them in, then why would the next day on the 5th, as more votes are being counted, would Trump and Biden both lose votes? Because the argument has been that there's a surge, right, that went to Biden. So how would that surge result in less votes the next day?
Yeah, I got to be honest. I don't entirely know all the details of the Wisconsin one. But look, they're weird stuff. I mean, here's another one. Michael Tracy pointed this out. Another Georgia fact. In the state whitest county, Bannon, on the border with Tennessee, Trump received 26% more total votes than he did in 2016. Biden received 34% more votes than Hillary Clinton. A lot of the stuff is strange. So I see where you're coming from. And I do get that it's never, they're always anomalies. The question becomes, are those anomalies legitimate in the sense that somebody is intentionally trying to cheat, or are they just anomalies in the way that they're reported or in the way that the information comes up? I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately. And I wish I did. Well, I mean, this gets to Tulsi, right? I wish you wanted to have the transparency in the voting stuff, and people didn't necessarily back it. The interesting question is why? Why do you think that none of these people, be it Republican or Democrat, wanted to fix the electoral system? Because it didn't have to be this way. We didn't have to be in this situation where it's I think Wisconsin is dodgy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you. And don't get it wrong. I don't know for a fact if it's blatant election fraud, an anomaly. We don't know. But that's the problem, Jamarl. We don't know. And there should be no reason that we don't know. And there should be no reason that even after we've known that, all these voting machines, like Milwaukee is one of the only counties in Wisconsin that uses voting machines. So that's already a problem in and of itself because we know that that's proprietary software. In other words, we don't have access to it, but someone that we have that has no accountability, right? They get backdoor access to that information. And so now I have to wonder about these. I mean, look, they're already claiming that Biden broke Barack Obama's record by 4 million votes and counting. And now that sounds all well and good because everybody's like, oh, mail-in ballots and there's an increased voter turnout and even Trump beat Obama's record. And yeah, that sounds good, except for why are they losing seats in the House if that's the case? Why are they losing seat in the Senate and they're not taking that back if that's the case? Why are we not seeing the gubernatorial and mayoral victories that we saw across the country when Obama did this? There is a history that we can follow to determine what legitimacy looks like when you're talking about record-breaking campaign. Joe Biden's campaign is the most statistically anomalous campaign in the history of the United States of America. And I'm supposed to just accept this as being true, knowing that the DNC has zero problem cheating their own Democrats. And so I'm supposed to think that, oh, man, Donald Trump is exempt from that rule, though. The DNC definitely wouldn't cheat Donald Trump if they can get away with it. When I saw firsthand, people think that, like, the Democrats don't have – whoever counts the votes are basically who determine the outcome of these elections, especially in larger cities. I was observing a poll with Tim Canova in 2018 when he ran the independent general election, and I was kicked out because I noticed that a poll worker was arbitrarily separating ballots. And when I mentioned it to the person who was in charge, she called Brenda Snipes, the election supervisor who was fired for cheating Tim Canova once and then subsequently cheating again. She told her to call the cops if I wouldn't leave, and I was legally allowed to be there. But they wanted to make sure that in the most important district in Broward County, that Debbie Wasserman Schultz did in fact beat Tim Canova. Now, as most people know, that ended up being a massive controversy that resulted in 3 election supervisors getting fired, all Democrat, by the way. And I mean, it made the news all over, and it held up the election. So, like, this has nothing, like, the general election is not what determines whether or not a Democrat or a Republican has control over the counting in a given district. That's not how it works. If the Democrats have control over that district, understand they have control. Oh, I mean, hell, in Wisconsin, the elections,
the chairwoman, the chairwoman, Ann Jacobs,
they endorsed Biden. She endorsed her.
Yep.
She endorsed him.
Yep.
So I'm not like knowing what I know about history. I'm just not going to accept things as being true just because it makes people uncomfortable. They're so caught up in their Trump derangement syndrome that they can't see what's right in front of them.
Well, and so here's another thing. One of the things I heard you talking about in the broadcast you were doing the other night, you were actually criticizing absentee ballots as such. You were talking about, you brought up a Jill Stein lawsuit pushing away from vote counting machines to paper ballots again. Does this tie into you're saying absentee ballots are used to cheat? I think that might be a direct quote. Why do you feel that suspicious about them? What makes you say that?
Oh, well, because I don't just pay attention to elections in the general election. I pay attention in places like California during the jungle's primaries, where I saw progressives getting cheated across the board. I saw situations like Nancy Pelosi waking up, like they say, oh, the counts have started, and then Nancy Pelosi got 7,000 votes before anyone got one. And they say, oh, this is because absentee ballots. Everybody who turned in an absentee ballot just happened to vote for Nancy Pelosi. Or the situation with Tiffany Caban, who ran for DA in Queens, New York, when she effectively won. She won, and it wasn't by a little bit. It was by thousands of votes. Well, the next morning, you know what? Some absentee ballots just showed up to the doorstep of the election commission. They counted them, and the only one, even though there were several people who ran in that race, the only one who got all the absentee ballots, except for like maybe 50 of them, was the neoliberal that the Democratic establishment backed. And it was just enough, maybe 15 or 20 votes, just enough to beat Tiffany Caban the next day after she had a clear victory by literally thousands of votes. And this is what we've seen time and time again. My team tracked the chain of custody in California because we were trying to figure out what the hell is going on with these absentee ballots and mail-in ballots. When we went, because you're supposed to be allowed to observe the count even for mail-in ballots. So when we asked, well, where are they going next? They had no idea. They had no idea who was going to get the ballots. They had no idea who was counting the ballots. They had no idea what city they were going to next. They had no idea what order the ballots were going to be counted. In other words, even though we are legally allowed to count the ballots, we couldn't even get the information to know where the ballots were going to be counted in order for us to observe that count. And it's not a coincidence. And it's in this idea somehow that, Democrats are just the ones who have always inherently benefited from absentee ballots and mail-in ballots. That's actually not true. It's always been Republicans. Now, granted, this particular time, the Democrats were going to benefit at least at least a majority, right? At least a majority, because we understand that Trump did discourage people from using mail-in ballots for the very reasons I was just talking about. However, with that being said, I think it was clear from the beginning what the Democrats were at least thinking about planning on doing, because they made such a big deal about this USPS defunding. Oh, there's a defunding effort in the USPS because he doesn't want you to use mail-in ballots because it's going to somehow help Trump cheat if there aren't mail-in ballots being used. And that doesn't really make any sense, by the way. But they always kind of tell on themselves, because that was largely their goal. Now, it's funny because they claim that all the defunding of the mechanism that the USPS would use to push to get these mail-in ballots out, and yet there was a ridiculously high mail-in ballot turnout.
Let's do this. Let's take a break. We'll be back. We have Nico House joining us, political activist and broadcast journalist, founder and CEO of MCSC Network. We will be back in a moment. Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in D.C. Joining us is political activist and broadcast journalist, founder and CEO of MCSC Network, Nico House. Nico, so what do you think, how do you frame all of this? Meaning, if you're looking at, let's say, 2020 in general, or just all of it, meaning from the time Trump got elected to now. And you can be as broad in your framing, as broad as your thoughts, as you want to be. But basically, a kind of a political analysis or political climate from your perspective of the world in regards to what has happened over the last 4 years. And what does this mean going forward in regards to the Biden administration?
Well, I like to look at how we arrived here and what took place on this journey. Now, as I recall, in 2016, after Trump obliterated Hillary Clinton, election fraud was not only possible, but it was an absolute. It absolutely happened.
Yeah, it was likely. It was like it was a flat fact thing that happened for Hillary Clinton to lose. Yeah.
Exactly. That's the only way. And in fact, Jill Stein used that to expose the system with her lawsuit, of course. And coincidentally enough, guess where the discrepancies were? That's right. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. She exposed all those systems. And don't get it twisted, the system worked very hard to make sure she couldn't expose them. And there's a lot of Supreme Courts in those states that tried to prevent her from pursuing those recounts and reconciling those votes in those voting machines. Now, of course, and in between all this stuff, Bernie gets cheated again. We saw what happened with Tulsi. Even the exit polling discrepancies during the primary. Tim Canova gets cheated again in a more spectacular fashion, but this time it just happened to make the national news. Brenda Snipes destroyed 20,000 ballots of Tim Canova's and got caught in a federal court of law, and she was fined for it. Okay, so now we fast forward. And even the night before, the 4th, the night before, so on the 3rd, whenever the election we thought was coming to an end, the Democrats were already saying, get rid of the Electoral College. Russia must have interfered. That's what had to happen. It was disinformation. They were coming up with their pre-wrapped excuses. And then the next day, we woke up and, okay, wow, I didn't realize that literally every state was going to go to Joe Biden in the middle of the night. Not sure that's how that works, but that's what they're claiming. So now when we bring up, we just be skeptical of the results. Just ask for, verification of those results. It's, you must be a Trump supporter. It's not like we've not been saying be skeptical of results since 2016. But because it involves Trump and Joe Biden now, it's, no, you must be a Trump supporter. No, I'm saying the same thing I've been saying. You need to be skeptical of these results. But now there's no such thing as election fraud. If you're questioning election integrity, that means you're trying to break down the fabric of our democracy. We should never, ever, ever, ever do that. You know what that sounds like? That sounds like authoritarian dictatorship language. That's what that sounds like. Don't ever question the results. If you do, you need to be thrown off the internet. You need to be censored. You need to be put in a jail cell. You're just for the opposition party, and you're not for our democracy. You need to leave the country, et cetera, et cetera. And we're in my opinion, and when you can see in my in an election, and once again, this is my opinion, being so blatantly stolen, right in front of. Fiorello was watching. So here's Go ahead.
Thank you. This is years at this point of Democrats specifically trumpeting, crying out about electoral interference from Russia. I mean, this is years of that. And practically the entire DNC voting base, as far as I can tell, everybody that I knew, including a lot of staunch Biden supporters, they were aware of what the DNC did to Bernie back in 2016, particularly. It's not like people don't have the possibility of this on their minds. It's that Trump is up. They're up against Trump. It's that Trump is the person they're running against. And so both in 2016 and in 2020, there's a big enough of a boogeyman to justify whatever's actually going on here. Here's the thing, though. What do you think Trump's going to go? And that's ultimately probably what's going to decide this, because by all appearances, Biden's about to take it. CNN's saying that Jared Kushner or Ivanka Trump might be the person to try to convince Trump to step back and step down to let this happen. But from what he's been saying, from what Trump's been saying, including in his press conference last night, he's not going to do that. He's pushing for a legal battle, might go to the Supreme Court on a case-by-case basis, could see recounts in some states, and that could decide where this thing goes. What do you think is going to happen on Trump's end, Nico? What's your expectation there?
This is one of the few times where I'm praying that Trump's ego takes over, because although I'm not cheering for Trump, what it could possibly expose is the inconsistencies and the lack of transparency in our system, all the ways that our system has failed us. And not only this time around, but I'm sure in some circumstance, in every election in the last 20 to 30 years, it has failed us. It's just that the discrepancies may not have been caught for whatever reason. Maybe somebody had a clear enough, like Obama, right? Obama had a clear enough victory that nothing would have really mattered because he just got, nobody gets 90% of the black vote. That should never happen again. But when you're Trump, let's be honest. Let's be objective here. This man got more votes from people of color and black people than any Republicans since 1960. That's insanity.
Well, his numbers went up, believe it or not. His numbers among blacks, among Hispanics, they went up.
Every single demographic except for white males. That's the only demographic that he didn't increase in vote percentage. So
mind blown. Just a pause on that for a second. I'm gonna let you get right back into it. But mind blown. That's everybody. I don't know who expected that, but that's probably the most resulting outcome of this election, to be honest. Anyway, Nico, you could feel free.
It's funny because I feel like Jamarl. I feel like the last time we talked on my show, we actually were like, it looks like that Trump's gonna do something crazy with the black vote. For better or for worse. And I kept telling people, I'm like, I don't know why I think that. I don't think as many black people hate Donald Trump as much as people think. But I do think that a lot of people underestimated the hatred for the Democratic Party and how many black people's lives were destroyed by Joe Biden's policies. I think a lot of people underestimated that. I think that they underestimated how many people remember who put them in those cages and who created those cages to begin with. And at least at the very bare minimum, Trump pretended to give a damn. That's all he did. And hell, sometimes that's all we want. All right, can you at least pretend to care? And he did it just long enough at the right times to make people think, well, you know what? At least it's better than the side pretending they're not going to give a damn, And I think that that's what it comes down to. But given all these facts, he broke Obama's record too, which is also just kind of bizarre. Because you're like, wow, okay, I've never seen a situation where two presidents broke the record in the same race. like broke the popular vote record in the same race. And people can make the argument, oh, it's just the population ain't crazy, it's da-da-da-da. Yeah, except for, see, Trump took back seats in the House with his.
Yes, that's the wild part. And that's something Shane mentioned. It's like, if Biden got that many more votes, how did he get that many more votes but lose seats in the House? Like look, I agree with you that some of this is anomalous. So don't misunderstand me. And I have no issue with recounting every state. And of course, that's overkill, right? I mean, you don't need to recount every state. I don't think every state is in question. But I have zero issue with recounts. The entire point, let's just be very clear, of an election is to figure out who the public wants. That's it. It's a count. That's all it is. No more, no less. And yes, you have the changeover of power and everything else. But at the end of the day, the mechanics of it is, I make a vote, a bunch of other people make votes. Somebody, honest actor, counts it. And he counts it in front of everybody so everybody can see it. I have no issue with that. So I have no issue with Trump calling for recounts. I don't even care if there are reminders there to observe, court-appointed reminders to observe them counting. I just want to know who wins, whether it's Trump or Biden. I don't have a dog in this hunt.
Yeah. And I think it's hard to know how to move forward as a nation and as a movement unless we truly know who wins so we can actually look and figure out why and how they won, right? It's not just for this election, but it's kind of, we have to keep an accurate history of what took place, because we're going to use these numbers just as statisticians and commentators and analysts for years. I mean, it's the most controversial election, in my opinion, of all time already. And that's important just for history's sake. And I agree with you, Jamar. It's like calling for a recount should never be controversial. It wasn't controversial when Al Gore did it. So I'm not exactly sure, or tried to, I should say, but I'm not exactly sure why it is now just because Trump is in office, other than the fact that people are clearly suffering from Trump derangement syndrome.
Well, you know why. You know why. Because if they do that recount and you find out one or two things, either Trump ends up winning, which means that the first count was problematic, which means you have to have a third, because otherwise the other person is not going to accept it. Or, like you said, there's a flaw in the way that these things are counted and the way these things are so forth. And, you know, if you have a serious challenge to the electoral system where the person is like, no, I want to know that these votes are what these votes are. And you start opening the covers, maybe you find things you don't want to see. And maybe it brings questions about previous elections. And that's, I got to be honest, I do not think that that's what they want. I have a hard time believing, whether it's media or whether it's the political class, that they want those cupboards open. Now, mind you, whether there's anything in it or not, I just don't think that's something that they want to touch. That's real. They don't want to go.
Right. What happens when you try to recount and you can't do it for some reason, right? Because, I mean, that's basically what happened in Wayne County whenever Joe Stein opened up that lawsuit in Michigan. They wanted to recount the voting machines in Wayne County is where the Detroit area is, and they couldn't reconcile tens of thousands of votes. Now, this is Joe Stein conducting that lawsuit. Imagine when Donald Trump is doing it, he's the president, and he is indeed the tweeter-in-chief, right?
Why do you think Clinton didn't push for that? You mentioned Jill Stein. Why do you think Clinton didn't continue to go for that? Because she stopped.
Because of what you just said. Because of what you just said. And don't get it twisted. Yeah, I'm sure that the Republicans did what they do in general elections, right? Like, don't get it. They're not innocent, not by any stretch of the imagination. However, see, Hillary Clinton and her little team also tried to cheat. They tried to. And because, once again, whoever counts the votes, that's to determine who wins. Wayne County is a blue county. Detroit's a blue county. The people in charge of the voting machines are more than likely Democrats. So if there were discrepancies in Detroit, who was likely the beneficiary? Hillary Clinton. And even with all of those discrepancies, you still got your butt handed to you. And then once again, that exposes a part of the system that no one really wanted to acknowledge. And like you said, now, if this happens, now you're going back and say, hold up, well, did Hillary Clinton really beat Donald Trump by 3 million votes in a popular vote? It's probably going to be a no. Then they're going to want to go back even further. Then they're going to want to go back to Al Gore. And like, you're opening up a can of worms that I don't think the establishment on either side, which is why the Republicans are just as kind of frantic about getting Trump to step down and resign. You know what I'm saying? Like they're just as frantic. Like people think that the Republicans are largely the populist right may be behind Trump, but the rank and file Republicans are trying to tell him to not combat it.
I know, but Nico, this goes beyond just this notion of. Look, you have to also accept that the Republicans and the Democrats that are in office that have been able to get power with this system the way this system is. And if you are trying to demolish the system, good, bad, in between, that undermines the position to which they found themselves. Meaning, they're not going to want a demolishment of the U.S. government for Trump. None of them are. And the notion of who cedes power and who's sovereign, those things are vitally important issues. And the last thing we want in this country is to have this kind of breakdown where it's unclear on who wins, on who's the sovereign.
But do you really, Jamarl, do you really think the Republicans are going to choose? Do you think they're going to push for Biden over Trump? Is that what you're saying? Also, I just want to throw this in there.
It's not that I think they're going to push for Biden over Trump. It's that I think that they don't like this notion of challenging the electoral system in the United States. I don't think either side likes it.
I don't know. I could see that. I mean, it could also just be chalked up to the fact that Democrats, of course, are not going to want this because if they do the recount, there's a good chance that they'll lose. Nico, we've only got a minute left here. I just wanted to say, can of worms, it's also Pandora's ballot box. They do not want to open Pandora's ballot box. That's not a good idea on their part. They are definitely opposed to that universally. What were you saying there, Nico?
Well, no, I was going to say, I think it's a combination of both. You got to remember, when it comes to politics, it's usually a lot of things that come into play when it comes to one single decision. And I do think that, no, they don't want to lose to Trump, of course. Especially, they validate everything that Trump says. And let's be honest, right? Every battle Trump has taken to the Democrats, he's won. Why wouldn't I challenge? I've always won.
Well, he didn't get that stimulus.
Oh, well, yeah, there's that. But that was for us, though. And we don't win. We never win. It's never.
This is, guys, you've been listening to Nico House, political activist and broadcast journalist, founder and CEO of MCSC. Nico, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Nico, NIKOCS, F as in Frank, B as in boy. You can also find me on Rockfin at Nico, NIKO, Odyssey at Nico House, and YouTube, of course, Nico and the MCSC Network.
Excellent. And you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back for the wrap. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
This is Radio Sputnik.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back, and we are taking your calls. The phone number is 202-521-1320. And the show you're listening to is Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. This is our last segment this week, our last call-in segment, but also our last segment in general. We got Tarif on the line. And again, our phone lines are open, 202-521-1320. Tarif, you're on. What's going on?
How y'all doing? Gentlemen, I have 3 comments. The third one is kind of lengthy, but ain't going to be that long. The first comment is Kurt Ruby said something last night on LaRue Spec saying a software program that was made by the U.S. government called the Scorekeeper is a software program that can change votes in the split of a second that need to be investigated. He knows the person who created it. They need a million called March to Washington peacefully, protesting. The third comment is kind of lengthy. Trump have nothing to lose right now. He need to push these executive orders, single-payer jobs program, legalize marijuana for American use, Glass-Steagall, and I forgot the 5th one. And finally, I wanted to say, once he do all that, then he say he will offer amnesty to anybody that was involved with any type of cheating with the vote count or with the voting count. Amnesty to them, and plus $100,000 and pay their salary for the rest of their lives, and become forward with information and proof of cheating that's going on. $100,000. So anyone with
that's bribery. That's
Is it?
bribery, and not just bribery. It creates an incentive for somebody to come forward, whether or not cheating had taken place or not.
What isn't that also? That's a whistleblower award. Is effectively what he's talking about, right?
For life?
Isn't that what he's? Yeah, for life is probably much. I think Tarif, that's I wouldn't say for $100,000. If he believes that there's a lot of fraud going on, then he'd be bankrupting the Treasury at that point. That's a lot of. I mean, I'm kind of being facetious there, but that's a lot of money to throw around. I mean, that's one side of it. I like the sort of last hurrah idea you had with Glass-Steagall legalizing marijuana. Other sides of it, pardoning Assange. It's a big plank there. I don't see him doing it though, but I like that that's where your mind's going. With the 1 million call for a 1 million person march on Washington to bring the public's attention to these allegations. I don't know, man. I don't see that happening. I'll be honest. I like where your mind goes with some of this stuff. I like the big picture ideas, and I'm excited about it. But with that particular one, I just don't see him doing it. We do have other calls. Tarif, thank you for the call. We got Stedman calling in from Detroit. Our phone lines are open, 202-521-1320. Stedman, you're on. What's going on?
Hey, so, I'm in Detroit. Nico talked about Wayne County. He talked about a lot of the inconsistencies. And so I actually have a show that I just started with 3 friends of mine. It's called the Freedmen's Collective. We only got one video up. But on Election Day, we went to 3 polling locations in Detroit, and we interviewed people about why they came out to vote, what they hoped to have happen. And we kind of just took an account of the polling locations. I went to my own personal location and 2 more in the city. And I never saw an uptick of people coming to vote, right? And so there were still black people voting. But, I mean, they were supposedly going to be Biden supporters. But at my own personal polling location, I didn't see an increase in people coming to vote. There were no long lines. And so, I'm really surprised about the result of the election, how it seems to have been turning out. And kind of, I want to say this to Jamarl specifically, because I've been following him for quite a while. And it's kind of what Nico already said. Jamarl can concede that the Democrats cheated his guy. He says that a lot, and I agree with him. And so how can you concede that they're willing to cheat your guy, a Democrat, a person who is willing to sheepdog his own progressive supporters, of which I am one, into a neoliberal corporatist party, and not believe that, as Trump is still anti-establishment. I mean, what's the Chamber of Commerce? The U.S. Chamber of Commerce supported Biden. The Lincoln Project, all these different, hardcore Republican mouthpieces, tools, whatever, supported Biden over Trump, that the Democrats and the Republican establishment would not come together and say, hey, we're going to take Trump. But that video on my page on YouTube is going to be available Tuesday between 7 and 8 p.m. if anybody wants to watch and see Detroit, like in person. We didn't edit anything out. It's just a video of people coming to vote on Detroit on Election Day. The Freedmen's Collective, FREEDMENS Collective on YouTube.
Wait, stay on the line. So a few things, right? Is it possible that something nefarious took place in the elections, whether it was done by Democrats or Republicans? As a flat fact, how would I know? Meaning, how could I say yes or no to that? I don't know. Do I believe Donald Trump? No. Donald Trump lies constantly. Donald Trump lies as easily as Donald Trump breathes. So no, I'm not going to accept the word of a liar in regards to nefarious things that have taken place. Also, it's anecdotal evidence is limited. And so I don't know if there were these expansive things. I could say, I don't think you're lying to me in regard to what you saw. So fair enough. From a standpoint of cheating in the race, that needs to be validated. Like, it's not enough to say, I have this expectation, I think there's cheating somewhere. You need to validate that. And it needs to be validated with evidence. Now, if you want to have this thing where they redo a reading of the election, do it. I'm for that. If you want to redo the votes, meaning from the standpoint of trying to redo them again, do that. The problem is, if you go with the analogy or you go with this notion that there was cheating, and you just feel it, I just feel that they were cheating. I can't necessarily put my finger on it, I just feel it. Then you can feel that they were cheating in any county. even in the recount, especially if you're using machines where you don't necessarily have access to the technology and it's proprietary and you're just spitting out the results. Meaning, whatever you're getting out from that tabulation of the machine isn't necessarily that what you're getting as vote count. You're getting what they give you as a tabulation anyway. Meaning, you're stuck with the result. You need to get rid of these machines, and you need to have this kind of transparent thing where people can just kind of paper votes and people can see them counting, or you're going to always have this doubt. So it's not that I think it as a flat fact that everything was above board. It's not that at all. I take most things as 0 to 1 from a level of accuracy. It's only assertions. And until there's something a little bit more than assertions, no, I don't buy Donald Trump's argument that the only way he's losing is by cheating. I think it's nonsense. So,
But when you look at, you say you accept that Trump is a liar, but
yes.
We understand that Biden is a liar too, in the same way the Democratic Party. And so at best it's a wash. But like some of the stuff Nico was talking about, you're seeing an increased turnout for every demographic for Trump outside of white males, and simultaneously Joe Biden is getting more black votes in Georgia than Barack Obama or whatever. I lived in Georgia during the Obama election. I was at Morehouse College, so I was around black people, and we were all excited, right? It was a party on election night. But I can't tell you that I believe that Joe Biden and a black vice president is conceivable that he got more votes than the first black president in the United States of America, who didn't have a history.
Stedman, real quick. We've got two other callers, and I want to make sure we get to them. But I also had a follow-up question for you. You briefly mentioned you've got a new YouTube channel. I just wanted to make sure. I did not hear the title of that YouTube channel. It was kind of muffled. What is the title of that so people can check it out?
The Freedmen's Collective.
The Freedmen's Collective.
Back to the Freedmen's Bureau. Yeah, but it's men. It's plural. So MENS. So Freedmen's Collective.
Okay. All right. Thank you for the call.
Tuesday between 7 and 8.
Awesome. Thanks, Stedman. All right, we got two other callers. I want to make sure we get to them. Shelly from Michigan, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hi. First, just love your coverage. Huge fan of the show. I do have a question for Jamarl, though. He was saying that he's up for a recount of the election and all that. And if it does go the legal way and they do have to put it through the courts and do a recount and anything, do you think it's possible the line of succession could take over?
Oh, that's so interesting. You mean like going to House of Representatives? Like if these guys are fighting back and forth, Trump refused to concede, it goes to electorals and all that other stuff, like where he gets this kind of, I don't know. Like that's...
It's a legitimate path forward.
Well, if Donald Trump just says, I'm not going to concede, and he sends his own electors, and he, it goes through the courts, all that stuff, but at the end of the day, he refused to concede, and it hits the House of Representatives, where the House of Representatives decides, and you have a Democratic House of Representatives, but it's not each individual Democrat, it's states. And right now, you have more Republican states than you do Democrat states. And so, look, conceivably, Donald Trump could end up in office despite losing the Electoral College, despite losing the popular vote, and despite not going through the courts. Isn't that phenomenal? Talk about a coup.
It's crazy.
And it will be legal.
It's an interesting idea. We should get, here's the thing. We're going into a contentious season here. We should get somebody on. We should try to find somebody and get them on, an expert on like constitutional jurisprudence, that kind of thing, because this is true. These are uncharted waters. We just don't know what the heck is going to happen. I will note, if I'm reading the question right, the next runner up there in the line of succession, that would just be Pence, right? Either that or if both of them have to concede together,
states choose.
It would be Pelosi.
No, states choose. It's a state delegation that chooses, meaning Republicans right now, even though you have more Democrats holding the House, what ends up happening is it's a state delegation that comes to make the choice in regards to who they want. And you have more Republican states than Democrat states. I know it sounds wild, but usually people concede. Like usually you don't get to this point where the guys are just fighting it out tooth and nail for everything they can get out of it. But he does have a path to taking the White House without going through court and without this other stuff. He just doesn't have to concede. If Donald Trump just says, I want to win, I don't care about anything else other than holding on to power. And his wife, his family members, the other Republicans, none of these people can get him to drop out. Then it gets interesting. I do think you need some level of support for that, though. I don't think you could do that just as a lone man. I think you need people to kind of back you on that. And if Chris Christie is not even backing Trump, I don't know if this is a viable path for him. So we'll see.
We will. Yeah, weird times we're living in. I think I kind of don't know what else to say. Interesting. Sadly, I said we had two other callers. The second caller dropped out. So Eric, calling in from Arizona. If you want to call in some other time, we'd love to take your call. But I suppose we're just going to have to close it out here.
What do you think about that? I mean, like Van Jones was talking about this. And he was like, look, we've never had a president do it. But it could happen where a president like fights that hard tooth and nail and he has enough support to try to push that through. And there's enough confusion. And you know for yourself, when we get into these areas where it's like unclear, oh man, that like you're in no man's land. So it's 2020.
We don't like being in no man's land.
No,
yeah, we're not used to, we're no longer in the exploratory era. We don't have that kind of vitality, arguably. We're used to living in a system that for the most part takes care of our needs, I think, at least tries to, or maybe doesn't, but says that it's trying to, that kind of thing.
Yeah, we like to know what happens or what's the process. In this case, this becomes, like you said, this is we're up in the air, and it really does depend upon how far the personalities involved want to push it, and that's where it gets very interesting. So we'll see.
It does. And with Trump, the thing is, Trump is a lot dark and slightly less bite, but he does have some bite, and he could try to push this. And obviously he's saying he's going to. There's the possibility that he's just going to step back at some point. It seems to be what people in the administration want him to do, but it could get contentious. Thankfully not as much civil unrest as we were afraid of. Anyway, we're closing the show out. Thank you to Engineer Andre. Thank you to Cam and Raheem, our producers. Thank you, Jamarl Thomas, my co-host. And thank you listening. Back on Monday, signing off. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Guys, Fault Lines, Thomas Stranahan. Another one is in the books. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Another great show. Really interesting show today. Really interesting show. I did a video yesterday that they blocked, and that video was so good because it got into what the last caller was talking about. And so what I'm probably going to have to do is redo that video, and I'm probably going to redo that video now. So I'll see you guys in a few minutes. But I am going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I'm going to say subscribe. Let's get to the chat. We do have a few chats though. So we have Italian Stallion. I love that name, Italian Stallion. That's my issue. If Biden won so much, the Senate and the Congress should have flipped a lot more. I mean, the majority voted for Congress and the Senate and Biden, but I feel like... So, look, maybe the solution, or maybe... Because I agree with you guys. There's anomalies here. Like in regards to the vote tally. It's like, how does Biden get more votes than Obama? Like, that just seems weird to me. And if he got that many, why didn't it flip? So, look, I don't put it past what you guys are saying. I guess my thing is redo the vote. I mean, everything up to this point is unclear. And there are anomalies that are in our vote system. But do you really trust Donald Trump to be the determining factor in saying that there are anomalies? I don't. Donald Trump lies ferociously. So if you want to check it over, recheck it. If there are states that are, that need court minders to look at those states, fine. My thing is I hate the confusion, and I hate the fact that it is unclear. Paper ballots. But I strongly suspect that both parties keep these elections unclear for this very specific reason. And that's the unfortunate part. We should have transparency in our elections. And it's the greatest democracy on the planet with an inability to count. No, these should be recounted. If Donald Trump wants to have these lawsuits, fair enough. If he wants to have some of these states recounted, fair enough. But counting until he wins is nonsense. And right now, I don't have necessarily anything to point to give me this idea that Donald Trump, that the cheating is rampant in the way that he's saying it is, even though in 2016 it was perfectly okay when he got in office. So, look, we'll see. I mean, I'm not against having minders and redoing the vote total, but I do think we have a problem in this country from the standpoint of knowing as a flat fact, not just because you're told so, but knowing that your elections are legit. But also keep in mind that you have political actors that don't care about the result of the election. The only thing they want is to win. And that also always has to be kept in your mind when you're thinking about this type of stuff. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and subscribe. Thanks all.